Good morning to our Canadian participants. Good afternoon and good evening to those who are joining us from different time zones. My name is Alexandra Gheciu. I am the Associate Director of the Center for International Policy Studies here at the Université d'Ottawa. And on behalf of CIPS, I am delighted to welcome all of you to our workshop on AUKUS among democracies 1 year later, an event in collaboration with the MINDS program of the Department of National Defense. I am honored to help host this event that addresses key issues and questions not only about AUKUS, but also more broadly issues of friendship, trust or lack of trust, strategic culture that have shaped policies vis-à-vis AUKUS and that will continue to have important implications for regional security, for thinking about international relations, and for the international order for a long time to come. I would like to thank all of our participants for agreeing to join us today. And in particular, I would like to thank my friend and colleague, Professor Sergean Vucetic, who really is the main organizer of this event. And if we are here today, it is thanks to his brilliant work for over a long period of time. So thank you so much. Really impressive, and I'm deeply grateful to you. I would also like to thank our CIPS team for their wonderful assistance. And last but certainly not least, I would like to thank Pierre, our technician, for making it possible for us to be here, at least virtually, in the same room, despite persisting travel complications due to COVID. And finally, before I give the floor to Sergean, I hope you will allow me, on behalf of the Center, to give voice to the indigenous affirmation. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada, who call this city home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. With this, I wish everyone a wonderful event, and I would like to invite Sergean to please take the floor. Thank you all so much once again for joining us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sergean Vucetic. Like Alexandra, thank you, Alexandra. I'm extremely grateful to be here today. It is a big event for us. We've been planning it for about a year. As soon as we heard about this thing called AUKUS, we wanted to know what it is, what it does. And in order to answer these two questions and many more nearby questions, we invited all of you, and we aimed for diversity in terms of geography, but also in terms of political and theoretical and policy positions. And I think we achieved that. I'm just looking at the schedule for today. We have 11 papers, 15 authors, 2 discussants. Thank you to all of you. 3 people in the CIPS team helping us with this. We certainly have geographic diversity. We have Tokyo, we have Houston, we have Brisbane, we have Yogyakarta, we have Kuala Lumpur, we have Newport, Rhode Island, we have Leeds, we have Bath, New Delhi, Copenhagen, Montreal, and Sydney. So we are coming from literally all over the place. So indeed, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and big thanks, especially to those who are staying up really late or waking up really early to be here with us. We have a lot of people registered for this event, about 150. So this means some housekeeping rules. As we said, while planning for this conference, we wanted it to be much like International Studies Association conferences, where presentations go for about 10 to 15 minutes max, and then they're going to be back to back, such that our chairs / discussants, mostly discussants, let's face it, Amos Hoare and Caroline Dunton can respond to all at once. Before we do that, however, we will probably take a little break after all the presentations are done, just for I guess pedagogic reasons, also health reasons. So short break, and then we're going to go to the discussant. And once the discussant is done and you get a chance to respond to their comments, we'll open it up for questions and comments from the audience. I guess Alexandra and I will be reading them out to you, and you'll be also able to see them in the chat. I think that's it for now. Once again, big thank you and warm welcome on behalf of the Center for International Policy Studies here at the University of Ottawa. Perhaps I should officially give the word to Amos, who will chair this first morning session. Thank you again.
All right, thank you. Welcome to this fantastic panel. So as Serjan has highlighted, we've got a really rich mixture of perspectives on AUKUS, including perspectives from both inside and outside AUKUS. We've got perspectives and dimensions on the military, interstate, and effective dimensions. So we'll go in order of the program, and in case you don't have it, let me just quickly read it out to you. So first, we've got 6 papers. First, we'll have Atsushi Itago and Yui Nishimura on AUKUS in Japan. Second, we'll have Ama Umar and Yulida Santoso on understanding Southeast Asian responses towards AUKUS. Third, we'll have Hu Chu-ping, Malaysia and South Korea's responses to AUKUS. Fourth, John Calbury in AUKUS and arms deal tech sharing, both or neither. Fifth, Jack Holland, the ties that bind AUKUS as the old Anglosphere coalition. Sixth, Nick Pierce, the Indo-Pacific and British politics. So in case you missed it, each speaker will go for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll take a 10-minute break and return for Q&A. So without further ado, let me introduce the first paper, AUKUS and Japan. Atsushi Itago is a professor of international relations at the School of Political Science and Economics, Waseda University. He is specialized in the scientific study of international politics. He is also a global fellow at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. His co-author, Yui Nishimura, is a PhD candidate of Rice University. She was the winner of the William P. Hobby Award for her paper, Normative and Strategic Naming and Shaming in the UN Universal Periodic Review. So without further ado, let's welcome the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is Atsushi Itago. I'm actually joining this from Kobe, where I live, rather than Tokyo. This is the work, well, no, before that, thank you so much for organizing this wonderful workshop. And I'm thrilled to be part of this. I know it's kind of awkward to start this third-party outside view of AUKUS, but I suppose that it's 10 p.m. for me. I hope I wouldn't go to sleep in the process. I guess my kids are sleeping, so should be okay to start this session with my paper, I guess, AUKUS and Japan. It's an original survey experiment work. Try to show you how Japanese regard the AUKUS and how they expect how it's going to be in the Indo-Pacific region. Okay, I hope this one moves. Okay, here we go. So motivation. Well, past studies have revealed that moral foundations such as human rights violations or the humanitarian crisis can drive public sentiment in support of military operations or foreign policy decisions broadly. However, the impact of values or norms on security cooperation is still limited. One relevant study is done by Jonathan Chu and his co-authors, showing that shared value rhetoric increases support of American general public for an alliance operation, helping a country holding the same value. However, there's not that many studies there, and especially on the AUKUS and in Japan, our study is probably the first one to show you how the Japanese sees the importance of the common value, well, liberal democracy and human rights, and also how that will be effective deterring China or Russia or other potential enemy states. So key questions of this study is that there are three of them. If they means the Japanese support AUKUS and emerging new security cooperation among democracies. If Japanese support including other democratic countries, particularly South Korea, as a partner or in such security cooperation in the region. Obviously, Japanese and South Koreans, even though we are the democracy, we have the shared enemy, North Korea, but we've been having a hard time for getting along. Because of the Japanese side, we have the history textbook issues, Yasukuni. Of course, South Koreans have their problem from our side, but obviously, we are democracies. We should be able to cooperate. However, that should be tested if Japanese thinks that the South Koreans, as the same democracies, should be a part of the security cooperation in the region. And of course, as I said, in the one slide before, if Japanese consider AUKUS can deter China, Russia effectively. We expect the respondents' belief about AUKUS and its influence can be affected by the emphasis on the shared value of liberal democracy, and whether Japanese likely a membership of such a group. By using a survey experiment, randomly manipulating those informations on the shared values, we measure the level of the support for the AUKUS and other aspects of the security cooperation in the region. By the way, our paper is done. So if you have interest, you can send me the email, Google my name, and you can get the paper. This online survey is really fresh. It was done in September 2nd. So we load up this paper in a month. The number of valid responses we collect is over 1,000. And we fielded the survey using Lucid Marketplace. That's all usual, relatively cheap, but the more, I think better than the Yahoo Crowd, which is like crowdsourcing MTurk type of the survey, the survey outlet. I mean, well, Susan, I think I've been having a hard time for doing the workshop in English. I've been not in the foreign countries conferences for over 3 years, I guess. And after obtaining consent to participate in the study, we first asked the warm-up questions about the respondents' political interests and attitudes on using forcing in international relations. And then we asked the AUKUS-related questions. For the experiment part, we set the control group, which is like just showing the information, basics on the AUKUS. AUKUS is sort of known among the Japanese, but it's not Quad. So people somehow recognizes the combination of those three countries, but for them, AUKUS might not be as familiar as Quad or the, of course, US-Japan alliance. So we just showed a simple paragraph saying Australia, the UK, US have decided to create a new alliance called AUKUS. It is intended to be a security framework that contributes to peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region, which countries in authoritarian regimes in mind. That's the control or baseline group. For the treatment group, we set the two of them. We added the following additional sentences after the aforementioned simple paragraph. And treatment one is AUKUS is self-defined as an alliance countries that see the protection of liberal democracy and human rights as a fundamental values. Treatment two, we make the respondents read the same sentence. However, we plus that Japan is also considered as a likely member. So it's like more of the making the respondents feel that we are in group. After reading those vignettes, we asked the respondents to, do you support or not support new alliances like AUKUS? And pick one up you think is closest to the idea. We used the 5-point scale. And of course, and in addition to the other, in addition to these questions, we asked the other couple of the questions, whether the people would think that the AUKUS will become a strong ally like NATO, or Russians will be deterred, or China will be deterred. if South Korea should support in the AUKUS, blah, blah. Yeah, so those are the list of the questions. And of course, we asked them multiple times kind of possibility of the new security cooperation in the region. So we actually specifically said, asked this question that we will give you the list of the countries like Mexico, Vietnam, Philippines, or South Korea, Taiwan. Do you think we should invite those countries as a member of the new alliance in the region? And those are the key questions. And we show the results of the survey. Well, spectacularly, we failed. We couldn't get the significant difference among the groups. I mean, the baseline treatment group 2, they're basically same. There's no statistical difference between the level of the support for the AUKUS. So unfortunately, even though we expect shared value treatment or the shared value plus in-group Japan potential membership treatment would be affecting to increase the support for the AUKUS. However, it was not the case. And for the AUKUS membership by treatments, we asked the couple of the countries like South Korea, Canada, New Zealand, Japan. South Korea is obviously different shape of the distribution. Canada, New Zealand, Japan, they look almost same, and they are actually same. But for the South Korea, significantly lower support for inclusion. So people know South Korea democracy, liberal democracy, however, we actually make a difference among those lines, like, historical bilateral background. We actually somehow do not like South Korea to be included in AUKUS. We actually asked the second question for just showing the title is actually probably not correct, but we asked we are going to create a new security cooperation in the region. Which country should be included? Again, the South Korea is not as considered as a good candidate for the partnership. Of course, the US, Japan, Australia, Taiwan, New Zealand, they are actually selected as the partner they should join. Most of the people answered that way, but for the South Korea, that was not the case. Perception over the deterrence against Russia and China, we saw that the treatment would work for these questions, but again, it was not the case. So there's no group difference. People are not that optimistic, especially for the China. People think that the China will be deterred by the AUKUS. Most of the answer comes to the number 3, which is that we actually cannot tell. And for Russia, somehow that the 4 and 5 are larger group than 1 and 2. That means that the people think that the AUKUS can deter Russia. Like maybe people know Russians are not as strong as China, maybe by seeing how it's going on in Ukraine, and that may be the case. By the way, for the Korean membership and the other that deterring questions, the deterrence of China and deterrence of Russia, we actually see some tendencies among the people that who support the AUKUS actually supports the South Korea to join in a cooperation, and also they expect that the AUKUS can deter. So if there's a people who believes that the AUKUS they actually think that the South Korea should join liberal democratic security cooperation. And also they believe Russia and China can be deterred by the cooperation among the liberal democracies. And that's actually consistent. I guess we believe this is somehow showing that the Japanese internationalists probably have some sort of tendencies that they believe in AUKUS and the somehow that the who hates South Korea, and those are probably somehow isolationist sort of set of mind. They would not believe the possibility of AUKUS to deter China and Russia. But anyhow, this study actually shows that the liberal democratic understanding and the shared value as a key of the security cooperation, it's not as effective as the previous study, especially the Jonathan Chu's international interactions work suggests. It can be just because that the field was Japan. Their study was done in the US. That could be the case. Also, we actually have to admit, probably our, I guess that our study's treatment was too weak in the setting to obtain the significant difference. This is tentative conclusion, and I probably should finish now here. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Atsushi. Okay, next up, we have Ahmad Umar and Yulida Santoso from Universitas Gajah Mada on understanding Southeast Asian responses toward AUKUS, the politics of regional security identity. Umar, will you take it away?
Okay, thank you very much, Amos and Serjan. And yeah, thank you very much. I will be presenting work in progress, actually, that I'm now currently developing with my colleague, Yulida Raini Santoso from Gajah Mada University in Indonesia. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the ownership of the land of the people of Turbo and Jakarta, upon which University of Queensland is built upon in the city of Meanjin in Brisbane. So okay, so I would like to begin firstly by highlighting some problem that has been discussed by analysts and then some Southeast Asian scholars about the way Southeast Asian countries are responding to AUKUS. So most of the analysis tends to point out that Southeast Asian countries' responses towards AUKUS is deficit and incoherent. For example, Indonesia and Malaysia has made a strong reservation to AUKUS, and then Indonesia even point out that Australia, especially, has an obligation to adhere to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation with Asian countries. And also, there are some moves by Malaysian Prime Minister, for example, Dato' Saifuddin Abdullah, who has also made a similar reservation in early launch of AUKUS. However, some countries in Southeast Asia was also responding through welcoming the AUKUS. They are still critical to the great power contestations, but they have some kind of neutral to positive responses towards AUKUS, which could be seen, for example, in Singapore's response, or Vietnam and the Philippines. So the questions that I would like to highlight in this paper is about as to why there is no current response towards AUKUS in Southeast Asia. And from that questions, we would like to ask, what does it actually tell us about the construction of regional security identities in Southeast Asia? Does Southeast Asian countries have similar stances to respond to security challenge? And what are the variables that could explain the coherence of the responses? So some existing explanations from Southeast Asian scholars about regional security identity in general and also to nuclear security cooperation, attempts to understand Southeast Asian security in terms of the idea of the collective identity. So scholars like Amitav Acharya, for example, or Peter Katzenstein, and several other scholars articulate the idea that understand Southeast Asian countries' response in terms of collective identity. For example, highlighting the Asian way, the idea of non-interference as outlined in the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, also peaceful settlement of disputes. So more recently, scholars like Stephanie Martel, Matthew Davis, or Deepak Nair, for example, outline more rigorous explanations by understanding Southeast Asian identity is articulated through diplomatic rituals, for example, or by articulating a specific discourses towards polysemous language. These explanations leads us to an idea that actually the Southeast Asian countries' responses are bound by a collective identity in the regional level. However, we think that these explanations are strong. However, I think there are some problems if we want to understand Southeast Asian countries' responses towards AUKUS from this perspective. So the first is that these perspectives are limited to understand the regional complexity between ASEAN and its member states, in which Southeast Asian countries have actually dynamic responses and regional variations in responding to security challenge. The second is that I think this collective identity explanations is limited to properly account for ASEAN countries' engagement with major external actors, in which they do not usually, then they do not necessarily follow the logic of collective identity strictly, especially after the Cold War. And it could be seen with regard to Southeast Asian countries' relations with China and United States, which affect, as I will show in this paper, it affects the way in which they respond towards AUKUS. And I think we need to go beyond the Cold War understanding of regional security, in which the idea of the regional security is not understood in terms of black and white perspective, understanding simply by threat and survival, but also there are national security dynamics and also intra-regional security dynamics that we need to explain to understand Southeast Asian countries' responses towards major security challenges, especially with AUKUS. Here, before we continue with AUKUS, we would like to propose a specific framework to understand regional security identity in Southeast Asia as multi-layered and negotiated between actors or between states in the region. The regional security identity is multi-layered in the sense that we need to differentiate between regional and national context, and then acknowledging the intra-regional dynamics that underpins it, and then it is negotiated. So while collective identity at the regional level does exist, its existence is actually contingent to normative and political dynamics in the national level. So we plan to understand also these Asian countries' responses towards AUKUS by highlighting three central elements. The first is normative conceptions of order, in which a specific normative interpretation of the purpose and goals underpins Southeast Asian countries' responses towards AUKUS. The second is about the political conceptions of order, in which a perception towards major external actors at the national level also shape the negotiation in regional level, especially when it comes to engagement with the major external actors in economic and security context. And we understand regional security identity as hierarchical, in the sense that states and political agents are important in regional security, and then the way they delegate their foreign policy making will be very much depending on the centrality of the issue in this context. So our argument based on this framework is to understand Southeast Asian countries' responses towards AUKUS as a form of a new security dilemma here. So we argue that the Southeast Asian countries' responses towards AUKUS is shaped by new and evolving security dilemma as maintained in two key aspects. The first is about Southeast Asian countries actually want to maintain balance of power, especially between United States and China. But also they want to seek benefits through extra-regional cooperations and engagement. The second is that we see that Southeast Asian countries' responses towards AUKUS as in which they want to reject great power interference. It is visible in the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in ASEAN, as well as the Asian outlook in Indo-Pacific. But also, some countries in the region also desire security from extra-regional threats in this context. The implications of our argument is that when it comes to new security challenge like AUKUS, Southeast Asian countries will be faced by this new security dilemma. And the implications of this is the fragmented intra-regional responses, in which they prioritize national over regional security. The ways in which this dilemma can be solved will be maintained by, we argue later, the leadership of a particular country in making the ASEAN institutions work. So if we take a look from this framework, so wait a minute. Okay, so if you take a look from this perspective, we see that actually the idea of the regional security identity in Southeast Asia is evolving. So we see that actually Southeast Asian countries already have a framework to manage and mitigate nuclear security cooperations in the region, both of which evolved from the early Cold War era in the 1970s, and it was established through a particular treaty after this Cold War through the Southeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zones. So we have seen that actually, in the context of Cold War, there are an interesting ways in which Southeast Asian countries respond to major security challenge by articulating the zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, both of which are actually undergirded by the Cold War. So we have the ongoing escalation of the Vietnam War in the 1971, for example, in which it was the high phase of the Cold War, and Southeast Asian countries actually fear nuclear escalation that could affect the regional stability. And also, we have the interstate territorial disputes in Southeast Asia, the conflict in Sabah between Malaysia and Philippines, and also the confrontation between Indonesia and Malaysia, which actually shape the ways in which they maintain regional security discourses through institutionalized matters. And then since 1967, ASEAN has already maintained the Asian way, the idea of non-interference peaceful settlement of disputes, and then the idea of the regional resilience. So if we take a look at the history of the ZOFAN, we could see that the idea of the regional security has been undergirded by the centrality of ASEAN in this context. After the Cold War, we have the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapon Free Zone Treaty, in which the idea of the ZOFAN, which was established in the Cold War, was institutionalized through a treaty, even though this treaty is not actually being signed by major nuclear powers. However, it managed the relations between ASEAN, the core ASEAN member states, with the ASEAN enlargement in this context. Okay, so moving quickly with the case of AUKUS. Why do Southeast Asian countries not having this kind of sophistication and this kind of collectiveness in responding to regional security discourses in the context of AUKUS? So our argument first is that Southeast Asian countries are faced by a new security dilemma in this context. They want to maintain the balance of power between the United States and China, but some of the countries are actually seeking benefits through extra-regional engagement. So we have the Belt and Road initiatives, for example. On the other hand, we have the continuation, for example, of FPDA and rise of the joint military exercises, in which these Southeast Asian countries are actually trying to seeking benefits from extra-regional major actors. On the other hand, they actually want to reject the great power politics, and it creates the first security dilemma for Southeast Asian countries. The second is that they want to maintain neutrality. They want to reject great power interventions, but also some of the countries also face the South China Sea disputes, and then they are also desire security from extra-regional countries. Here, the conception of order is important and is shaping the regional stability and regional security discourses in which they are faced by the China question, which I think it leads to the idea of the prioritization of the nation over regional security discourses. So the conclusion is that we have faced a new security dilemma in Southeast Asia. The question is that, is ASEAN relevant? We argue, and I think it will be developed further, it is still relevant, but we need a regional leadership and operationalization of framework for extra-regional engagement. We have, ASEAN has the ASEAN Outlook of Indo-Pacific, which is not necessarily being obeyed in terms of extra-regional engagement. For dialogue partners, including Canada, we need to understand evolving regional norms in Southeast Asia, and then strategic engagement, not only in bilateral basis, but also acknowledging the regional basis. So I think this is my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Umar. In my case, I realized I forgot to introduce Umar properly. So let me just briefly introduce him. Ahmad Umar is an associate tutor at the School of Political Science and International Studies, University of Queensland. He is also an external research associate at ASEAN Studies Center, Universitas Gadjah Mada, UGM, Indonesia. His co-author, Yulita Santoso, is a teaching staff at the Department of International Relations and managing director of the ASEAN Studies Center, also at Universitas Gadjah Mada. Our next speaker is Hu Chu Ping. She'll be presenting on Korea and Malaysia and South Korea's responses to AUKUS. Hu Chu Ping is a senior lecturer in strategic studies and international relations at the National University of Malaysia, University Kebangsaan Malaysia. She is concurrently a member of the Consultative Council on Foreign Policy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Malaysia, adjunct lecturer at the Malaysian Armed Forces Defense College and the Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations of Malaysia. Chu Ping, please take it away. Thanks.
Thank you so much, CIPS, and also minds for co-organizing this workshop. And I'm very pleased to get to meet so many of you, even though this is online. And thank you, Amos, for moderating this session. So given the previous two paper presentation, it prompted me to think about maybe I should find a co-author. So because I was actually pretty much caught up with some other problems for the past month, so I'm sorry that I didn't have a complete paper yet. But nonetheless, I have some something to share, because I wish to learn of your opinion about what I've been thinking about comparing Malaysia and South Korea's response to AUKUS. So so I hope you can see the full screen of the presentation. All right. So just like what Ahmad Umar has presented just now, so you can see the very similar concepts, autonomy and agency. But when Ahmad Rizki was using the regional context, so in my case, I'm actually looking into domestic autonomy, so each of the governments of Malaysia and South Korea, and how do smaller states assert their agency against great powers, realignment and repositioning of powers on the international stage. So why do I use a comparative approach is because there is interestingly similar but different variants of powers, interests, and identity in both Northeast and Southeast Asia when it comes to responses to great powers alignments. So, and both Malaysia and South Korea also have this very unique position when it comes to how to define their Western and non-Western characteristic of their government, governance, and also foreign policies. So, and both also in their respective regional contexts, known as weaker states or smaller states in their respective region. So even though South Korea is now the 10th largest economy in the world, but when set against Russia, China, Japan, and the United States, it's actually a smaller state in relations to that regional comparison context. So for Malaysia, just very briefly, a post-colonial state working very well with the former colonizer, the United Kingdom. So since the second prime minister departed from the founding fathers, this foreign policy option that is quite pro-West. So Tunku Abdul Rahman, the first prime minister, is very much pro-UK, pro-US, anti-communist. So with the racial riot that occurred domestically, so the second prime minister thought that it would be best for Malaysia to move forward in the middle of the Cold War to carve equidistant diplomacy and not choosing sides, as choosing sides incur more costs than benefits. So that has been the foundation of our modern foreign policy. And as for South Korea, we knew that we all know that it is part of US alliance, and but as it rise up through the decades, becoming a stronger, not only an economic power, but also very recently and defense industrial power as well. So it has started to forge many other multiple partnership with other middle powers or great powers, including Australia, Europe, and the likes. So in terms of both of their choices in defining their national autonomy, so it seems like Malaysia has more space in making the choices of don't take sides, while South Korea have narrower space in making the decision to distance itself from the United States, for example. But but the change of the domestic government actually matters a lot, as leadership actually define to what extent each country will define their agency and autonomy. And this is the major argument that I'm going to make in my paper. So the national autonomy refers to domestic politics and bureaucratic structure that have impact on a country's policy choice and their outcome. So outcome here refers to issues like responses to AUKUS and things like that. So for Malaysia, despite the change of governments, we do have continuity in terms of the Prime Minister not wanting to upset the relations, the equidistance between Malaysia with other powers, with the exception of Najib. So if there is any questions about that, I would try to answer them. So in short, advisors to the ruling elites is actually key to determine the policy choices that will be made under a certain government of Malaysia. So here I also differentiate ruling elites as different from the governing elites, meaning the decision makers within the civilian governing structure. So because of the unique emergence of the national security narrative as Malaysia's achieved independence due to negotiation with the colonizer. So internal security agencies such as police, internal affairs have greater autonomy than, say, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and even Ministry of Defense. So which is quite unique and an outlier when compared to many other countries, including in Southeast Asia. As for South Korea, there is a stark discontinuity whenever they change the government, especially from one ideology to another. So as the government presidents change, there is a high volatility of the advisors to the government as well. So we may see highly contradictory policy outcome due to the change of government in South Korea every 5 years since early 90s. So, however, when they decided on a policy position, they would implement it with the whole of government approach, which is lacking in the case of Malaysia. So to further, so for my paper, I will have a framework in which I apply in the both cases of Malaysia and South Korea. For example, in terms of national leadership, Malaysia depending on Prime Minister, South Korea's president, political system-wise. Right now, Malaysia is entering the era of coalitional politics, while South Korea is still very much a form of polarized bipartisanship. As for policy process, Malaysia is much more fragmented and South Korea is more centralized. So all of the combination of the domestic politics, policy processes, and the previously discussed national autonomy, thereby we will observe a kind of a different systemic behavior. So this research draws on the definition of hedging as a form of state behavior by Kwik Cheng Shui, a very good mentor and colleague of mine from the same university. So Malaysia is hedging without an ally. Even though we are part of the Five Power Defense Arrangement, FPDA, it is a form of security arrangement and not a form of alliance. So we kind of made that very clear. As for South Korea, they can hedge, but with an ally and with China as their top trading partner for the past decades at least. So in terms of how they are going to navigate the narrowing strategic spaces, given either it is about US-China great power rivalry or responses to the emergence of AUKUS. So I would be very interested in understanding how and why they want to mitigate a certain kind of risk posed to each of the countries, and how do they seize the opportunities to maximize their advantages in relations to strategic changes such as great power rivalry and also the emergence of a form of a new military technology partnership like AUKUS. So with that, I would also like to make clear that I don't see AUKUS as a form of political alliance with many Australian and also British think tankers, policymakers coming to the region, coming to Kuala Lumpur, explaining to us what does AUKUS mean. So I really think the main gist is that it is a form of military technological cooperation or partnership. So technology transfer play a very huge part in the AUKUS agreement. So it has already taken a life on its own as a form of a kind of a political alliance. So this is why in the paper presented by Professor Tagore and also by Ahmad Rizki, I think most of the arguments centering on the fact that it is going to be expanded into a form of NATO, it is going to endanger military or arms race in South China Sea. So I think we need to make that very clear about what exactly is AUKUS, so we can better analyze what exactly is the potential outcome, whether it is a form of fallout or intensifying competition among the great powers and such. So one of the arguments is that that I already said earlier is that Malaysia leverages upon this power asymmetry better than South Korea. Due to the makeup of their domestic autonomy structure and their ability in and flexibility in customizing responses towards strategic changes. So in terms of Malaysia and South Korea's responses to AUKUS, just a very brief comparison. So Malaysia, together with Indonesia, are among the earliest to express concerns and objection to AUKUS, but they are not particularly concerned about whether it is a form of so I think the earlier responses entail concerns over new type of political alliance, which is not conducive for regional integration, regional cooperation and such. So this is why after the explanation done by the visiting American, British and Australian politicians to Indonesia and Malaysia, I observed that both countries eventually have their officials retracting their earlier serious concerns and express that they think, okay, since they explained it well, it is a form of military technology partnership and therefore is less of a threat to the so-called regional cohesion and stability. So, however, despite that, Malaysia still have a dilemma to uphold neutrality, and thanks to Ahmad Rizki, so I don't have to explain much about Zopfan and Schonfest. But I would also like to highlight another side of the old feel-good principle like neutrality, Zopfan and Schonfest. Actually, not only for Malaysia and Indonesia, countries like Vietnam, Singapore, so we are all in the domestic drive for arms modernization with our partners, whether it is the United States, UK, Australia, or beyond the AUKUS partnership. So, so there is a need to fulfill our security concerns while also trying to be political correct in terms of upholding neutrality and such. As for South Korea, it as AUKUS was announced late last year, it led to a heated debate among the presidential candidates between the liberal and the conservative. And now we know that President Yoon Suk-yeol is the new South Korean president from the Conservative Party. So he openly called for US support to build a nuclear-powered submarine to better counter North Korean threats from the South Koreans' security point of view. But also when we see that after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, so it is to our surprise that the President Yoon actually did not try to meet with Nancy Pelosi. So of which Pelosi herself also expressed discontent and frustration. So the main reason for that, even though not openly explained, is actually to manage China's dissatisfaction. And in the case of AUKUS, South Korea have to manage China's and North Korea's discontent over the emergence of a new military cooperation partnership. So I did not finish my slide, so I was trying to put the screen cap together when I was listening, but the previous two papers are too fascinating, so these are all that I could gather. So I didn't manage to put together the South Korean one, so apologies about that. But that's all from me, and I hope to have a good discussion later. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Chu-Fing. I'm sure we're going to be following up for more questions later. Next, we have Christina Lai presenting the paper Taiwan, AUKUS, and the Liberal International Order. Christina Lai works at the Institute of Political Science, Academia Sinica, Taiwan. She was a postdoc fellow in China and the World Program at Princeton University, and she was a lecturer in global security studies at Johns Hopkins University in 2017 to 2018. Christina, please take it away. Thanks.
Yes, so good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Thurjan for inviting me to this workshop, and I'd also like to thank Amos for chairing this morning section. I think today it's really my pleasure to share my works on US-Taiwan relations, AUKUS, and the future of Asian security order. So in September 2021, so the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia has established a trilateral security partner, so-called AUKUS, aimed at upholding the rule-based order and deepening diplomatic and defense cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region. And recently, I think there has been several multilateral institutions emerging across Asia, such as Quad, Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, and Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and also the Five Eyes Alliance. They are both point to a possibility of a reconfiguration of the Asian security order. And AUKUS, as its newly established security arrangement, certainly carries a great strategic implication for Taiwan's national security and US policy toward the Indo-Pacific region, and also the prospect Asian regional order. So within this context, my current work in progress will kind of offer some thoughts on how the United States policy of strategic clarity toward Taiwan contingency can really enhance the resilience of AUKUS. And at the same time, I think US alliance or partners in Asia and Europe can also maintain a collective attitude of strategic ambiguity that kind of lessen the internal tension or pressure among the member states. And I believe that such kind of arrangement can not only help deter China's dominant or assertive behavior in Asia, but also help secure Taiwan's autonomy against Beijing's forced unification. We both know that Taiwan is at the forefront of Beijing's economic sanction and military provocation. But US President Joe Biden has publicly remarked that the United States is obligated to defend Taiwan several times. And each time President Biden has alluded to defending Taiwan from Chinese invasion, the United States Department or White House staff, soon kind of answering by retracting their corrected his statement. But I think Biden himself has attempted to, walk back on his remark on the U.S. military possible defending on Taiwan from, China's attack. So it could be kind of a tension between, U.S. foreign policy and Biden's, policy statement. I think I like to quote from a scholar, think tank member from American Enterprise Institute, senior fellow Hawk Branks, has perfectly summarized this tension. Right? Once it's a gap, but 3 times it could be a policy. Right? So following the U.S. Joe Biden's statement, seemingly kind of ending this U.S. strategic ambiguity. Right? But at the same time, a think tank member in the U.S., such as Bonnie Glaser, has argued that maybe maintaining strategic ambiguity will be better because it will provoke attack if we seek to deter, especially since the United States kind of lacks the sufficient military capability to prevent China from invading Taiwan, and Taiwan, as of now, cannot really defend the island. But I think with Biden's administration kind of diversifying the Pentagon resource for non-defense spending, and the G7 announcing the unprecedented or a long-term security commitment to Ukraine, it is certainly a really tiny debate, important question if the United States alone is capable of leading such efforts in maintaining China-Taiwan relation. But I think the most important thing is that securing Taiwan Strait must include not only the United States, but also Asian allies and partners, and such as Taiwan's primary security guarantor, right, United States, but also including other partners like United Kingdom or Australia, etc. We can all have interest in countering China's, military aggression or assertive behavior in the Asia-Pacific. Right? So I think Taiwan is certainly at the forefront of China's military provocation and economic coercion. So I think upon this establishment of AUKUS, Peter Dutton, right, his Australia Defense Minister, has claimed that the issue of Taiwan's sovereignty was the most likely flashpoint that might lead to conflict with China. And I think over the last few decades, the United States government has adopted policy of strategic ambiguity on Taiwan so that it can effectively prevent Taiwan from declaring a de jure independent, right? As of now, for example, the Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act only calls for reinforcing U.S. and Taiwan relation, but in resisting China's aggression. But it did not really specifically indicate what kinds of measure or additional resource they are needed to protect Taiwan against the PLA force. So I think in this sense, Taiwan certainly played a crucial role for the AUKUS in deterring China's assertive behavior. However, I think China's expansionist ambition and Taiwan quest for autonomy and emergent security partnership in Asia has created new challenge for alliance management in the United States foreign policy. And more specifically, I think that this disconnect between the U.S. long-held policy of strategic ambiguity and China rapid growth of military modernization, these things have to be resolved. And I think it should start with the recalibration of US-led security network in Asia. I think the time has really come for the United States to declare strategic clarity toward Taiwan. And this will be the official step that the United States will respond firmly to China use of force against Taiwan. And the shift from ambiguity to clarity will not only minimize the risk of conflicts in US-Taiwan-China triangle, but also foster a stronger US leadership in AUKUS. I think I can delve more on the kind of internal tension among the AUKUS state and possible more members who will likely join the AUKUS in the future, right? I think the recent cross-national survey has conducted by the Pew Research Center has indicated that nearly 70% of the respondents consider China's military power as a serious problem of their country. And more specifically, this kind of concern over China's assertiveness are pretty much really salient in Japan, Australia, and it also traveled across to European countries like Spain or Netherlands. They're also worried about China's military posture. But I think for all this country, while they are concerned, consider China as a growing security threat, they're still reluctant to openly hostile to China, even though that might be, seriously jeopardize their diplomatic economic interests. I think the risk of alliance entanglement kind of inherent in AUKUS and this potential, Quad Plus candidate, right, such as the United States, South Korea, or New Zealand. So I think the key challenge for the United States, US foreign policy, will be to maintaining the collective benefit for the security partnership while minimizing the drawback from the member state. So, I have to be honest, to be perfectly clear. I do not call for all this U.S. ally or partner in declaring, strategic clarity against China threat and committed troop to, a China-Taiwan conflict. But because I think such a announcement or joint announcement might kind of irritate Beijing, and probably China will take a hasty or rush, strategic move, launch attacks in Taiwan. But I think the internal pressure in AUKUS might still increase if U.S.-China's relation remain hostile over time. And the great power competition between China and Taiwan, between China and U.S., will definitely limit the kind of political maneuver on balancing strategy or diplomatic engagement for this middle-sized power to engage both United States and China. So in this sense, I think maintaining the ambiguity about commitment to specific specific measure, while deepening cooperation in this current security partnership will be a preferable way or a feasible way to go for this middle powers in Asia and also in Europe. I think all the member states in AUKUS cannot really overextend their security commitment across the Asia Pacific, and they must be kind of centered on this targeted defense cooperation in key areas such as Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, or the Senkaku Island. Right. Let me just highlighting one more the relevant example here. The AUKUS deal, right? The AUKUS deal on nuclear submarine, could have somewhat divergent effect, right? For example, on the one hand, well, these submarine may be available, in the coming future, like 2040. But Australia could really participate in undersea mission or counter the naval operation of possible adversary and contribute directly to U.S. Military strategy in Northeast Asia. But I think on the other hand, the AUKUS nuclear submarine partnership could exacerbate, the security dilemma by provoking China and Russia to, work closely even together to enhance their military capability. So that's this kind of security dilemma or internal pressure inherent in AUKUS member, and possibly, if AUKUS wanted to include more member in the future. And I think the Quad, right, the AUKUS, they are two of the most important region pact. And I think they represent a different form of partnership from the previously U.S. hub and spoke, system, right? And I think the Quad focus on providing public goods, for the Indo-Pacific, such as infrastructure building, public health, environmental protection, while the AUKUS will put more emphasis on regional stability and military training. But I think even though these two are different in purpose, but they are complementary, right, under the U.S. initiatives. So in order to uphold political leadership, I think the United States really need to adopt a proactive approach for alliance management, both in Asia and in Europe, and combining diplomacy and deterrent policy to engage China and how secure Taiwan's autonomy and maintaining the leadership in AUKUS. Yeah, I think that gets to the end of my presentation. Again, I'd like to thank Surgeon for inviting me to such a wonderful workshop. And as of now, I think I've learned a lot from all the participants in the morning. I'm hoping that in the coming future, I can really see all of you in person. It is still a work in progress, right? I'm still trying to developing a specific theoretical argument and gathering more data for my case study. And that's why I think I welcome your feedback and suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. All right, we're switching gears a little bit now. So the next three papers will focus much more on the internal dynamics of AUKUS. And first up on that, we have John Calverley. John Calverley is a professor of strategy in the Strategic Operational Research Department of the Naval War College's Center for Naval Warfare Studies. and a research affiliate in the Security Studies program at MIT. He is the inaugural director of the Bernard Brody Strategy Group. John, please take it away. Thanks.
Thanks, Amos. This is great. First of all, I just want to thank Surgeon and Alexandra for inviting me and making this possible. So far, tech has gone very well, Pierre, so thank you very much. And Amos, thanks for this daunting task of discussing so many papers. And finally, thank you to my Asian colleagues, or my colleagues in Asia. For the most part, you're staying up very late for us, and I really appreciate it. I learned a tremendous amount from your presentations. So I have to start off with the disclaimer because I work for the Navy. These opinions that I'm presenting are mine. They don't represent that of the War College, the United States Navy, the United States government. When I pitched this talk to Surgeon, maybe it was 6 to 9 months ago, we came up with this title, and then I called Surgeon up about a month ago with my head in my hands. I just said, I don't know the answer to this. I can't find anything out about this deal. And thank you, Surgeon, for grabbing me by the lapels and shaking me and telling me to get a grip and come to the conference anyway. So I don't know what the answer to this question is, but I am going to suggest a way to think about it, or a couple ways to think about it. And the presentations in advance that preceded mine were very helpful, because really what we're all talking about is how does one have agency vis-a-vis something as massive and important, but kind of inchoate as AUKUS. And so while my colleagues who preceded me focused on those outside AUKUS, I'm going to focus, as Amos pointed out, I'm going to focus on the players inside AUKUS. And Professor Vucetich and Professor Tago and many of my colleagues who are in this conference will recognize the fuselage of this airplane right away. This is the F-35. It's a legendarily expensive plane. It's going to be a total cost of $3 trillion US dollars. 11 years behind schedule. One critic called it the jet that ate the Pentagon. But of course, unlike any other plane on the planet in history, it has yet to lose an export competition. This is an unparalleled track record of success, which makes me say that, well, the F-35 is the worst combat aircraft in the world, except for all the others. And so the punchline, as many of my colleagues know, I've learned a lot from the F-35 that makes me think about the global arms trade in general. AUKUS is the worst submarine deal for Australia, except for all the others. And that's important. When we think about market power, when we think about selling something, and again, this is at least a selling of something to Australia, right? The price that the market sets is based on who you're competing against. And so the higher your price, the more market power you have, the higher the price you charge. And so that is why AUKUS is not a great deal for Australia if it ever happens. And I'll have a big caveat at the end of my talk on this. Okay, so let's start with the starting premise. This is a very simple theoretical assumption. I don't take credit for it. David Lake, Jim Morrow, many others have talked about this. But basically, any international arrangement, whether it's an aid deal or an alliance or a business deal between corporations, it's going to be a deal between utility maximizing actors, selfish agents. And basically, if these agents get together and say, hey, I'm endowed with one thing and you're endowed with another thing, and if we trade, we produce a surplus that makes us both better off, right? This is the law of comparative advantage. Well, then let's get together and negotiate a deal and capture that surplus. But of course, bargaining over the distribution of gains is zero sum, right? And it's based on relative power. This is Kreiser's big insight with life on the Pareto frontier. Okay, so when we think about security, right, I always tell my students that the only group of people that we bargain harder with in the United States than our enemies are our allies. Okay, allies are really tough zero-sum negotiations where people are trying to give as little as possible to get as much as possible, and that's an important way to think about AUKUS. Okay, so we're talking about the law of comparative advantage. We're talking about where do we fall on the Pareto frontier? And basically, like any business transaction, right, you can trade two things. You can trade capability for price. So let's imagine that Australia was going to buy a British submarine off the shelf. It would fork over a tremendous amount of money, and then the UK would come and stick that nuclear submarine on a big platform, or maybe sail it across the ocean, and then Australia takes delivery of that, and everyone is better off. Clearly, that is not what is going to happen. And so there must be other things that are going to be traded. And so one thing that we talk a lot about when we think about AUKUS is this idea of technology, right? So I'm going to give you a lot of money for your product, but I will give you a little more money if you will share some of that technology with me, so that I have a little more sovereignty, I have a little more, I'm a little more involved in the process, I can develop my economy, et cetera, et cetera. So those are kind of the three things that we think about when we talk about an arms deal as a first cut. Then, of course, there's lots of other things, right? As my colleagues have pointed out before me, right? This is a security alliance. It's designed to provide security for both the three players, but also they claim that it will have a spillover effect for the region and the global order, whatever that is. And also selling weapons is prestigious, right? We like to buy the best weapons, and we like to sell weapons to other countries. That makes us look good. And by we, I mean any country that can buy or sell weapons. Okay, so you see, it's getting a little complicated here, okay? There's lots of things that can trade. It's not like a normal business deal. It's politics. It's not just economics. And then finally, and this is the big thing that we have been talking about all morning or all evening in Asia, this idea of sovereignty, okay? And this is one of the big insights of David Lake with alliances. Often one state is going to give up some of its sovereignty, some of its autonomy, some of its agency in order to get security from an actor that is comparatively well endowed with security. Okay, so these are just ways to think about what is at stake. Okay, and now there's three players, at least for now: the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. And then if you want to think about how this trade is going to evolve, this deal, well, then you have to figure out what the comparative advantage of these three actors is in all these categories. Okay, so that's the framework, the trade framework I'm going to work with for the rest of my time here. And the second thing, and this will be no surprise to anyone in this virtual room, is that the United States is tremendously advantaged when it comes to selling weapons. Okay, it has actually, contrary to what Ethan Capstan and I predicted years ago in Foreign Affairs, the United States is actually increasing its market share. That's only going to go up as Russia becomes less of a factor in the global arms market, thanks to its debacle in Ukraine. And again, there's lots of reasons for this. The United States has a massive defense budget. We fight a lot of wars, and we tend to fight them more successfully than the Russians do. And then also, these weapons have what's called in tech a network effect, that the more people that buy the F-35, the more valuable the F-35 is for everyone involved. And I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Okay, now this is my second big theoretical argument. The way to think about this arms deal is what I call the hegemon's curve. And it's based on a very old concept, but it's captured very colorfully by this very famous defense industrialist named Norman Augustine, which basically means the last 10% of your weapons performance, right? That's where almost all the cost is, all right? That's where almost all the problems come from, okay? And so if you think about, if you're building a weapon, right, you think about our initial two-factor trade where we want to get capability versus cost. Well, the more capable the weapon is, right, the more expensive it is to build. That seems pretty easy assumption. And then we could just think of all the different things we can build and how ambitious they are. And as you can see, aircraft carriers in the top right, and just a little bit down and to the left are nuclear submarines. Oh, excuse me, my microphone popped out. So we are talking right now, when we talk about nuclear submarines, we're talking at the very high end, upper right-hand corner of a very ambitious weapon that has a lot of capability and a frighteningly high price tag, okay? And these are things that we use, the United States and other countries use for what Barry Posen calls command of the commons, whereas the bottom left-hand corner, this is what Chinese thinkers would call counter-intervention. Barry Posen would call it the weaponry of the close fight. They're more defensive, right? So defensive weapons are cheaper because they're less ambitious, right? If the United States, if Australia had purely defensive needs in mind, it probably would not be investing in nuclear submarines. It has a theory of its security that means it wants to send submarines very quickly, very far away to have a combat effect. Okay, and then because of Norm Augustine and general laws of production, right, the further out you get on the curve slopes downward. Okay, so we we understand that the more expensive, the more ambitious the product is, the higher the cost is, and the marginal cost of producing that one more piece of utility goes up. And then my last insight is that different countries have different curves, right? And so as you get to the bottom left-hand corner, lots of countries can produce missiles, armored vehicles. You get a very competitive market. But at the upper right-hand corner, countries specialize, countries get better at things. And then you see divergence in capability to produce something. So I would say that the green line is basically the United States and the pink line is everyone else, right? So when you get to the upper right-hand corner of these very expensive, very capable weapons, you see a divergence in the market, which means a divergence in market power. And so market power leads to rent collection. And the United States generally decides to export weapons. It has not decided to export nuclear submarines in the past. So just doing that seems to be a response to a loss to market power, but there's still plenty of rent that the United States can collect in multiple forms as it goes through this AUKUS deal. Okay, and generally what it does, it collects it in the form of rent. So when the United States caught Israel selling UAV parts to China, it basically kicked Israel out of the F-35 program. By the way, we subsidized that program. So we are giving money in order to get a political gain back. Donald Trump got impeached for the fact that he actually asked for his President Zelensky to help him with his re-election campaign, or he wouldn't get the anti-tank missiles that the United States was trying to supply to Ukraine, again, with our money. So again, I'm a little surprised at Trump's use of the arms trade for political gain. That was not what I predicted in my theory, but there you have it. Okay, so I'm going to end with 2 more slides. This is just a rough guess at where various countries have comparative advantage. Yellow means somewhere in the middle, red means low, and green means high. And as you can see, when it comes to American nuclear submarines, the United States is pretty good at making them relatively cheaply. They're packed with technology. The United States has the ability to provide security in a way that Australia does not think it can provide security for itself, whether rightly or wrongly. And again, there is a certain amount of prestige to buying these weapons from and being the first kid on your block to have these new toys. As you can see on the right, I'm not sure what the United Kingdom has to do with this. So I'm interested in my colleagues who are coming after me to tell me what that is. And as you can see in the bottom tranche there, it really does look like Australia in the zero-sum negotiations that will have to take place over AUKUS, if AUKUS ever happens, is that it will have to trade quite a bit of autonomy in exchange for the other factors that it needs to purchase. One more concluding caveat. This is based on my assessment, is not based on any privileged information I have as a Department of the Navy employee. But like any economic activity, when you get to the flat of a production curve, things get weird, right? It's very hard to make these things. It takes big muscle movements to build an aircraft carrier, nuclear submarine, a giant specialized shipyard, which is why so much of AUKUS is centered around where are these things actually going to get built? Because right now there's no space in the United Kingdom or the United States, and a shipyard of this magnitude does not exist in Australia. So we might actually be at such an extreme point of the curve that my chart that I just showed you may not even work, in which case we're on uncharted ground and I can't tell you what's going to happen. With that happy thought, I will turn over my time to my colleagues.
Thank you, John. More questions than answers, perhaps. So next up, we have Jack Holland, presenting the paper, The Ties That Bind AUKUS as the Old Anglosphere Coalition. Jack Holland is Professor of Global Security Challenges at the University of Leeds. His work makes substantive contributions on US, UK, and Australian foreign and security policy, as well as theoretical contributions to critical constructivism and methodological contributions to discourse analytic approaches. Jack, please take it away. Thanks.
Thanks very much for the intro, and thanks for having me. Yes, it's really interesting. So I'm going to talk about a chapter from this book, and I'm going to spare you the PowerPoint. You just get my looming head if you sat in the room in Ottawa, so sorry about that. This book, Selling War and Peace, Syria and the Anglosphere, it came out in 2020 with CUP. Because it came out in 2020, I've not really been able to do a book tour with it, so it's kind of a belated, this is what I wrote. It's made less of a splash than I'd hope, because everyone was focused on other things for the last 2 years, right? So I've sent around the key chapter from the book. If anyone else would like it, drop me an email. The chapter on the Anglosphere, I would argue, is probably the first publication on AUKUS, and that's because I'm cheating, right? It's a year before AUKUS gets announced and gets named. I'm writing about something that I call the Old Anglosphere Coalition, which is those three AUKUS states, and it's an attempt to conceptualize and historicize and theorize what it is that this new unit of analysis actually is. It does it in a very historical and kind of IR theoretical way to look at what's the glue that binds these three states together. And these three states have been the focus of my work now for some 15 years, from master's and PhD all the way through. Previously, I would look at things like what are the differences between these three states? So how do they diverge despite sharing alliance politics? And increasingly, I've moved my research questions away from how can we understand the differences in these three states that continually go to war with each other to actually what is it that binds them? What are the commonalities? Because I think that's the more interesting and the more important terrain as we go forward. And at the moment, I think the answers to that, they're unsettled, and that's what makes it exciting. So there's a theoretical, a conceptual, an ontological shift to look at this unit of analysis, but we don't yet know if it's a polis, a political community, a security community, a coalition, an alliance, a transnational political space, or something else. We're still working that out. So that's the kind of academic gap. There's also, I think, a policy shift here. I spoke with the UK's House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee about AUKUS shortly after AUKUS was a thing. And Tom Tugendhat chairs that. He's the chap who would have been a much better Prime Minister than Liz Truss is managing at the moment. He's a very sensible foreign affairs chap. And he asked, you know, what's going on here? What does each state bring to the alliance? And I think that's increasingly the wrong question, is what can the alliance actually do? What can it achieve as a single unit of analysis? And I think that's increasingly being reflected in the policy community as we go forward, including on how are submarines going to be put together and where are they going to be built, right? As you know, SNP going to be happy? Is it going to be Glasgow? Whatever. I think they've moved on from that to actually, how can this coalition of states build these things so that they are greater than the sum of their parts? And that is new and exciting. So the plan is to talk about this chapter, but I've sent a 900-word blog through which tries to drag 4 key things out of the chapter and put it forward onto AUKUS. So I'm gonna focus my comments on these 4 key things, and they are, I'll give them to you first and then rattle them through in a bit more detail. So number 1, AUKUS aims to contain China. It's about defending the free world. This is about international order first and foremost, before it's about technology or anything else. Number 2, AUKUS is old, it is unique, and it is poorly understood, despite the fact that its future is going to be so highly consequential. So it's old, unique, and poorly understood. Number 3, AUKUS divides the old Anglosphere coalition, as I've theorized it, from Five Eyes. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I might preempt some of the comments in the second panel this afternoon as well. Number 4, and here's the kind of controversial one. It's controversial in lots of different directions all at the same time, so it's quite fun. AUKUS is built on racialized warfare. That necessitates critique. The critique is absolutely vital, but it doesn't mean that we abandon AUKUS. And that's the kind of premise to set up a debate that needs to take place on the recognition of the importance of war and race, but perhaps that these aren't actually terminal for what's being attempted, given the geopolitical challenges that are on the horizon. So let me talk you through those 4 things. So in 2021, US, UK, and Australia announced AUKUS as a trilateral security pact. Assessments of AUKUS have tended to focus on the nature of the military technology that would be shared: cyber, AI, quantum, hypersonic, and of course, nuclear-powered subs. Now that's important, but it misses these 4 key points that are going to underpin coalition efforts to shape world order. So first thing, AUKUS aims to contain China and defend the free world. AUKUS, I think, represents the drawing of lines in this battle to influence the Indo-Pacific. And that term is a shibboleth, Indo-Pacific, right? It's code for entry to a club of democracies eager to halt Chinese belligerence. Specifically, AUKUS is set up to constrain China's security ambitions, which have increased since 2008. More broadly, AUKUS seeks to maintain and defend a maritime capitalist system that starts with a free and open Pacific, premised on the rules and norms of liberal world order. Now, to be really clear and blunt about this, AUKUS is designed to win in this contest. It is designed to win. the potential spoils of victory are no less than the maintenance of a global order built in the alliance's own image. There's three things this comes out of in the immediate policy context. So for the UK, and yeah, if it's hard to work out what's going on with the UK, I do understand. It's been crazy for at least 6 years now, if not a bit longer. But AUKUS caps the UK's Indo-Pacific tilt. That comes off the back of the integrated review, and it's part of a quest to forge itself as global Britain. This is the security answer to what is global Britain, and most people still don't know what global Britain is, arguably including the Foreign Secretary. But this is part of the answer, right? So it's the Indo-Pacific tilt, it's global Britain. From the US, it's a continuation of Obama-Biden era efforts to pivot towards Asia, continuously being sucked back into other regions when the focus should go to this new region as it's understood. And for the Australians, there's been long-standing Australian security concerns around China across a whole range of issues that reaches back a really long way historically and to very recent history on things like Huawei and other kind of cyber security issues. China, for its part, is absolutely correct to lament the Cold War mentality that AUKUS is seen to be underpinned by, and that's because AUKUS does indeed indicate preparations to win in an increasingly bipolar or multipolar system. And it's going to do that by actively recruiting states uneasy about the implications of rising powers. As AUKUS develops, its networks and its remit will inevitably grow, and we can look to Inderjeet Palmer's historical work on the importance of elite networks, or Tim Legrand's contemporary research on what's going on with Anglosphere networks today to look at how these things inevitably have a mission creep. They will, whatever the correct metaphor is, brass hat things, and they will extend into to areas that they weren't initially intended to. That growth, though, will always be focused on the single objective that underpins this thing, which is contain China, defend the free world. So number two, AUKUS is old, unique, and poorly understood, despite a highly consequential future. So AUKUS is simultaneously new and a very old unit of analysis. Its history will inevitably shape its future. So the Foreign Affairs Select Committee have already noted how old-fashioned AUKUS feels, and it does, and it is, and intentionally so. So efforts to confront China are the outcome and continuation of entwined political, cultural, and military histories. The impulse to sculpt the geopolitics of the 21st century extends through the shared experiences of an existential 20th and the outbreak of peace at the end of the 19th. And at least one of you in the room and Otta will say it goes back mid-19th and ideas of social Darwinism and everything else. As recurrent brothers in arms, the perceived naturalness of the alliance is frequently taken for granted. And this is compounded by the fact that its unique qualities render standard approaches to coalition formation difficult. These are usually quantitative approaches, and often partial, because it is very, very hard to identify, isolate, and model complex and intertwined cultural variables that help to underpin whatever this thing is. I would argue it's incomplete and misleading to account for AUKUS and the existence of AUKUS through rational calculations of future power balancing, if those are done in isolation, because it is more than future power balancing alone. AUKUS is a long-standing, culturally underpinned and socially constructed coalition. Interest-premised explanations can't account for AUKUS inclusions or exclusions. These three states follow each other to war, even when conflict is not in the national interest. Nor is it a coalition we can model and explain through contemporary interacting variables alone. It's too highly nuanced. It is historically constituted as a community. And to date, we lack this appropriate ontological understanding of what AUKUS is: an alliance, a military coalition, security community, transnational political space, a polis, or something else, in the same way that we lack an understanding of these conceptual underpinnings. So number three, AUKUS divides the old Anglosphere coalition from other Five Eyes states, splits Five Eyes. The Anglosphere has always demonstrated a fading gradation. Today, a propensity to fight is what splits Five Eyes into two tiers. New Zealand and Canada remain close to the heart of the Anglosphere, but outside of those warrior states that would pass Tony Blair's old doctrine of international community test, which was, are you prepared to fight for liberal values? So this unusually borne out two-step process of Anglo-Saxon colonial and post-colonial relations that Canada and New Zealand have experienced have helped to dampen the militarism and the imperialism that remain evident within the AUKUS states. Canada and New Zealand are the victims as well as the victors of liberal imperialism, first from the UK and second from the US and Australia. And that generates a very different historical trajectory and a different degree of comfort with imperial warfare. It's led to heightened criticality, made possible by the perhaps taken for granted security that is afforded by virtue of having large, powerful, culturally similar and liberal imperialist neighbours. Number 4, the controversial one. AUKUS is built on racialized warfare that necessitates critique, but not necessarily disbandment. And I say not necessarily because I think that debate needs to take place. So AUKUS is co-constituted by its taste and talent for imperial warfare. The glue that binds is formed in significant part through repeated coalition bloodshed. Often these wars are fought against racialized others, and the Anglosphere is very good at writing difference and racializing its enemies. It's vital to dampen perceptions of a contemporary era that is constituted rationally in a broadly realist environment of great power competition, increasingly unconstrained by liberal limits. The current era, I argue, remains premised upon its historical legacies, with historical narratives of racialized violence at the heart of this new moment. Important practitioner reflection and public debate is needed. How can a tainted coalition past be reconciled with the need to prepare for future geopolitical challenges? The aim here then is to foster that debate on the troubling foundations of the alliance, such that AUKUS can be critiqued and held to account without necessarily calling for it to be abandoned, given the geopolitical challenges that have inspired its formation. The hope is that previous mistakes can be learned from in rising to meet these new global security challenges. So the kind of final couple of lines to end on are, the aim is that AUKUS can use force projection to prevent conflict. That requires careful diplomacy, and it requires an introspective debate. Both those things have to take place alongside the development of advanced and innovative military capabilities. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Last but not least, we have Nick Pierce, who's presenting the paper, The Indo-Pacific and British Politics. Nick Pierce is Professor of Public Policy and Director of the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath. He leads the Institute for Policy Research across the range of its research, teaching, policy programs, and public engagement activity. He has extensive research in policy research and government policy making, and writes on a wide range of issues, from contemporary British politics, public service, and welfare state reform to Britain's place in the world. Nick, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to Alexandra, to Sudan, and to yourself, Amos, for the invitation to speak today. It's great to be with you, and I've learned a huge amount from what I've heard this afternoon, or this morning as it is to you in Ottawa, or this evening as it is to those in the Far East. A lot of what I'm going to say is building on what Jack has just been talking about, actually, and Jack has covered a lot of the ground that I would want to do in this presentation. I want to look at the issue of the idea of the Indo-Pacific in British politics, the geopolitical idea of a trans-oceanic region, which has become a signature for US strategy and its allies in the regions, and to look at how it's been mobilized in contemporary British politics and whether it has historical lineages that help us understand its use in British political discourses today. And I'll draw here on the work of Jack and others, Sujan and others on the Anglosphere, as well as some recent intellectual histories of the idea of the Indo-Pacific and oceanic histories and historiographies as well that have become important in thinking about the Indian and Pacific Oceans. So the term Indo-Pacific was apparently first used by a Singapore-based lawyer, James Richardson Logan, in 1850, but the concept itself found its most consistent and developed intellectual treatment in Karl Haushofer's work in the 1920s and 30s, examining the Indo-Pacific as a geopolitical space. And it's more recently associated, of course, with Shinzo Abe in his 2007 speech to the Indian Parliament, and other works referring to a free and open Indo-Pacific, subsequently taken up by the United States, renaming its Pacific Command to the Indo-Pacific Command, releasing Indo-Pacific strategies. And now the Indo-Pacific currency is widely used in strategy documents, position papers in Australia, Indonesia, India, France, the Netherlands, and even the European Union itself. Now, the UK's outline of its Indo-Pacific strategy was fully outlined in the 2021 integrated review that Jack mentioned, but it's prefigured in the work, as is often the case in British politics, of conservative think tanks, in particular Policy Exchange. It created a Indo-Pacific Commission chaired by the former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper, endorsed by Shinzo Abe, as well as in the established foreign policy think tanks, RUSI, Chatham House, and others. And rising interest in the Indo-Pacific also took place alongside mobilizations on conservative backbenches, in particular in Parliament, amongst its think tanks and magazines and house journals, of the sort of Sino-Hawk perspectives, the China Research Group in particular. And the relationship, of course, itself between the UK and China, in particular in recent years, and at the same time undergoing a sharp tilt away from the Cameron-Osborne golden era, so-called, declared during Xi Jinping's 2015 state visit to the United Kingdom. So in the 2021 Global Britain in the Competitive Age, the Integrated Review of Security, Defense and Development Policy, the rationale for the tilt to the Indo-Pacific is as follows: that the world will have moved further to multipolarity by 2030, the geopolitical center of gravity shifted eastward to the Indo-Pacific, rising trade and economic growth opportunities, but also the rise of China and systemic competition, posing risks to UK interests and values and to maritime choke points in key supply routes. And also importantly, climate change as well, which takes up quite a large part of the document. In policy and practice terms, that means in economic policy, a shift towards seeking to join the Common and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnerships, as well as becoming an ASEAN dialogue partner, free trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand, and rollover EU deals with Japan and South Korea, a continued commitment to the Five-Power Defence Agreement, and a commitment to the Five Eyes. The integrated review says that the partnerships with Canada, Australia and New Zealand are at the heart of our tilt to the Indo-Pacific as we work to support them to tackle the security challenges in the region. And in practical terms, perhaps, and as well as symbolic terms, perhaps the most important was the deployment of the new Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carrier strike force tour and a commitment to a persistent naval presence in the Indo-Pacific. And when Boris Johnson announced the AUKUS pact later in 2021, he claimed that it makes visible and incarnates the Indo-Pacific tilt. Well, given what we've heard already this morning about the widespread use of the Indo-Pacific, are there issues for British policy and British political thinking that are distinct and that might help us understand AUKUS more specifically? Well, the UK's understanding and construction of the use of Indo-Pacific is, I would argue, inflected with its own political intellectual history. Most importantly, in recent years, the Brexit referendum and the posture of global Britain that Jack mentioned, part of the arguments made when Britain left the European Union or voted to leave the European Union was that the withdrawal from east of Suez had been a mistake, taken in conditions of national pessimism and an atmosphere of defeat and decline as the UK turned towards the European Economic Community in the 60s and 70s. And a consistent part of Eurosceptic political discourse in the UK has been to appropriate anti-declinism and to present Euroscepticism and the withdrawal from Europe as an anti-declinist argument. And referring back to, and these are the papers on the left hand of the slide here, or the wider defence review undertaken by the Labour government in the 1960s, there was indeed a specific Indo-Pacific part of that review, which led, as we know, to the withdrawal of bases in Singapore and Malaysia and the origins of the Five Powers Defence Agreement. And post-Brexit and in the integrated review, the UK argues that it has uniquely global interests, partnerships and capabilities amongst European nations and aims to establish a greater and more persistent presence than any other European country in the Indo-Pacific. And that's clearly aimed at France and its regions and departments, as well as its interests in the Pacific. And it's co-joined with a shift towards a more confrontational posture with China, and the integrated review strikes this uneasy balance with wanting to benefit economically from engagement with China, to engage with it on dealing with climate change at a global level, whilst at the same time pursuing economic decoupling in strategic sectors and systemic competition. And some Conservatives MPs argue that the Indo-Pacific is such an area of economic growth and development that the economic engagement with China can be ditched in favor of other regional partners. But there is also perhaps a longer prehistory to the Indo-Pacific than the story of Brexit and the withdrawal from east of Suez. Of course, we can go all the way back to the bloody and brutal origins of British colonialization in Australasia and Oceania, Captain Cook's endeavors, the mapping of the Pacific by British explorers, the search for resources for the British Navy. And the critical formative period takes place at the end of the 18th century and early 19th century, when particularly British power is consolidated by the East India Company in India, and increasing trade with China forces a spillover along the Malay Peninsula, the creation of the Strait settlements, taking over of Dutch imperial possessions in the Indian Ocean, and the Anglo-Dutch Treaty, the attempt of the Napoleonic Wars to exile the French from the Indo-Pacific. And it's at this point, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, that it has been argued the idea of the Indo-Pacific becomes and emerges as a single strategic system around which other powers begin to mobilize. That's an argument that Pardesi in particular has recently made. And the process of British imperial expansion at this time was for the most part maritime, although Sir Stamford Raffles, the founder of Singapore, had as his big ambition ridding the Indo-Pacific of the twin evils of Dutch imperialism and Oriental misrule, as he put it. In the end, the British created instead a set of strategic ports and trading posts, whilst turning the Indian Ocean into a British lake, but did not extend further beyond Sarawak, Brunei, and Borneo until the Opium Wars opened up British trade through the South China Sea. And it's at this point that a political economy, a subsystem of the British imperial economy, takes shape. And it's well known, opium exports to China from India balance the deficit on imports from China, giving some substance to the idea that the Indo-Pacific was an economic subsystem. And of course, there's a big difference in Victorian political economy between the tropics and the white settler colonies, where in the Anglo world, massive increases in migration, capital investment, intensive agriculture and industrial manufacturing, a decline by contrast in handicraft manufacture and the share of world manufacturing in India and China, and increases there in arable farming and primary commodity production. So a political economy takes shape around the Indo-Pacific. And in the second half of the 19th century, with the opening up of the Suez Canal, the Strait settlements coming under direct colonial office rule in 1867, and then the big increase in imperial rivalry in the late 19th century, the rise of Japan, the rise of American interests in the Pacific and so on, we start to get a discourse in British politics focused on world states and the development of the idea of Greater Britain. That is that in the future, in the 21st century, that the world would be divided into large states covering large land masses, populations needing to find their security in their size, and the division of the British Empire between, on the right-hand side here, the Victorian theorist J.R. Seeley, between the white settler colonies of what became the Anglosphere, the kith and kin colonies, of Greater Britain, and on the left, resisted by high imperialists like Lord Curzon, for whom India was the central imperial subject, and the great game with Russia was the primary struggle waged in buffer states of the Middle East, Central Asia, and India's northwest frontiers. For Seeley and Charles Dilke and others, the Indo-Pacific was primarily important for the kith and kin of the English race in the settler colonies and their security within the empire. And that also got reflected in Edwardian debates about tariff reform, pioneered, of course, by Joseph Chamberlain, who explicitly excluded India from his proposals, instead focusing on the English race overseas. And in the dialogue between theorists of land and the importance of land warfare and theorists of sea power, Mackinder versus Mahon. And post-World War One, of course, Britain builds a huge base, the Gibraltar of the East, as Churchill put it, in Singapore, which it's forced in 1942 to surrender, ignominiously abandon. And of course, at that point, the kith and kin colonies, the old dominions of Greater Britain, turned instead to the US for their protection, the ANZUS Pact in 1951. And the UK's role becomes one of supporting American efforts to contain Chinese communism more broadly. And then, as I said, the 1960s withdrawal from east of Suez. So what can we learn then from this historical sketch for the genealogy, if you like, of the Indo-Pacific in British politics? Well, firstly, and again, referring back to what Jack was talking about earlier, although there is occasionally deliberate historical bombast and neo-colonialism in recent discussion about east of Suez and global Britain, the history of British political thought and practice in Asia and the Pacific is marked by a consistent awareness of the reality of multipolarity, of contested and shared spaces, and the insistence by contemporary theorists like Rory Metcalfe and others that the Indo-Pacific is not simply a construct for bipolar rivalry between the US and China, but is a multipolar region with an important role for middle players, is also reflected in British political discourse. And there's perhaps an historical memory here of this contested transoceanic space, but also of the contingency and frailty of British imperial power, of weak empires, as Sharman puts it, or insecure bridgeheads in the work of John Darwin. Second, there is a clear hierarchy of commitment in the Integrated Review and other British discussions of the Indo-Pacific that reflects older racial and political hierarchies. And at the top are the US and the Anglosphere, the Five Eyes within which AUKUS is nested despite Canada and New Zealand's absence, and then regional allies and middle powers with priority given to former colonies and Japan and then South Korea. India is framed through the seemingly eternal post-colonial search for a transformation in cooperation that never seems to arrive. The Commonwealth features less than you might expect it to, and certainly less than in Eurosceptic campaigns of 1975 and 2016, or indeed in the contemporary priorities of the Royal House of Windsor. And these hierarchies mirror those of the early Victorian and late Victorian race hierarchies: Greater Britain versus the rest of the empire, the British or Anglo world dominions versus the subject colonies, and the new and old Commonwealth. Third and last point, the Integrated Review and other documents focused on the Indo-Pacific are replete with the motives and tropes of Britain as a maritime trading nation, as a global champion of free and fair trade, prioritizing freedom of navigation and unhindered commerce. So the Indo-Pacific and the Brexit turn away from the European Union has facilitated a return to maritime, naval, free trade and global imaginaries of British identity and interest, and away from continental, European, land-based and gravity models of trade. And it's on that point really that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia poses the biggest issue. Does it force a rethinking of these imaginaries of the Indo-Pacific strategy, even a return to the Euro-Atlantic, as some on the British left are arguing for, Mackinder's revenge? And we have in the recent weeks had the announcement by the new British Prime Minister, amongst other things, of a new foreign and defence policy review, review of the Integrated Review. And that will tell us whether this Indo-Pacific tilt will be maintained or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. So that's given, I think, a lot of food for thought. There's a lot of ways these connect with each other. So what we're going to do now, Sujan, do you want to say it or should I say it?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say it, but you know what? You say it. Let's take a little break.
Right. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. And after that, when we come back, I'm going to give some overview comments, and then we're going to open this up to Q&A. In the break, if you want to put your question in the Q&A box, please go ahead and we'll work with that. So 10 minutes, please come back punctually. Thank you very much. Great, thank you everyone. So first, obviously this is a fascinating and really rich set of papers that look at very different dimensions of AUKUS. I learned a ton from each paper, but I think you would agree that the sum is truly greater than the sum of its parts, right? And if you're looking for it to get even more complex, stay around for the afternoon session where there's even more dimensions involved. Okay, I'm going to try to keep my comments as short as possible so that we can have as much participation from the audience. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, even as I'm speaking. So my goal, I think, is to ask questions to spur discussions in two ways. The first is to provide some potential talking points that the audience may or may not want to latch onto, but also try to get a bit of a conversation to get going between the papers. For the panelists, feel free to engage with as much or as little of them as you like. These are more suggested talking points. So I've got three general questions and a couple of specific ones for each paper. The first general question that I think cuts across most of the papers has got to do with what we mean by order. And Chu Ping mentioned this briefly, which is that each author utilizes a different definition of order or what AUKUS is. We have the conceptualization of AUKUS or order as a military alliance that serves purely strategic objectives. Other papers suggest that order serves as a set of principles for how states should resolve differences and the kind of challenges that AUKUS might pose to that. Others think of order as a club premised on ties of bonds based on familiarity and history. And there's also a related but separate conceptualization of order as an expression of identity. And I might add from Nick's paper, a bit of a frustrated sense of nostalgia. So the question I have for the panelists is this: to what extent are these definitions of order or AUKUS sort of analytic lenses used to give us insight into AUKUS? And to what extent are these local understandings of order? So for example, for Atsushi's paper, to what extent is this Japan's idea of what order is and what's at stake with AUKUS? I thought it'd be useful to think about what each of these different responses, both inside and outside, what do they even think of is at stake or what is at order? And related to this, if anyone wants to pick it up, to Nick's great question, does Ukraine change any of this? Okay, second question. There's a little bit more to the panelists working on external perspectives to AUKUS, but the internal group can also bring it up, which is I thought for the group that was thinking about external the people who are not in AUKUS, that there's to me, surprising relatively little mention of China throughout the papers, which is surprising since most commentators in the West, at least, made explicit that AUKUS and to some extent the Quad was an anti-Chinese alliance. So I guess for me, this isn't a criticism at all, right? But a way of expanding the discussion. To what extent in these respective countries does China matter at all in these different countries' responses to AUKUS? Or is it just a sort of background condition? What do each of the panelists think the countries they're studying think that China wants from the Indo-Pacific? Is it an alternative order, shipping lanes, regional hegemony? And in what ways are these different countries' reaction to AUKUS in part a response to their perception of what China wants? Okay, my last general comment is a somewhat methodological comment. So each paper makes use of historical precedents, right? And they're quite different across the papers. So I thought it might be interesting if the authors could share a little bit about how they chose their historical comparisons. Specifically for the group of papers talking about Australia and the UK, I was a little surprised that CITO never really came up. And I thought CITO was an interesting comparison in part because CITO was partly a response to the Vietnam War, but it was also in response to an idea that communism was spreading because of China. And yet at the same time, the members included the US, Britain, but also France, which I think poses a little bit of a question mark for Anglosphere explanations. But it also has a little bit of a puzzle for the fact that the US kind of wanted to include Japan, but that was overruled. And Australia wanted to be part of it, and it was also overruled. So I think thinking about why the historical precedents we're using to compare AUKUS to might be helpful in thinking through some of these other instances. Okay, some quick questions for each of the papers, and I'll keep it very brief. For John, I'll start with John because it's in some ways the most basic paper on like what AUKUS really is, but also it's a little different from the rest. So what I got from John's presentation, I got a few things, but one of the big things was that nuclear submarines are both very costly to make, but they're also kind of inherently provocative because they're not defensive weapons by any measure. They're offensive ones, which suggests that what's going on isn't really, I think, just strategic thinking. And so this pairs nicely with the first half of the presentation, where John gave us a very useful framework for thinking about how things like AUKUS is never really just a military decision, but often a political one that involves things like prestige and sovereignty. So I guess the question is, for me, is this. It seems pretty clear what Australia gets out of this. It's a little less clear what the US does, especially if it's going to be selling expensive weapons that might cause spirals or security dilemmas to emerge in the Pacific region. And I guess, to me, as you're going through the presentation, I couldn't help but to wonder, is this the military-industrial complex that is profiting from this deal? Or do you think what's going on is a little bit more similar to what Nick and Jack are getting at? Okay, for Yui and Atsushi's paper on Japan. So really interesting paper. One of the interesting findings is that AUKUS, that for Japan, AUKUS isn't really thought of in terms of regime type or liberal values. Instead, we get other things that sort of confound it, like this historical relationship with South Korea. So I've got two kind of biggish questions here. The first is this focus on liberal values a pretty Western thing that just perhaps doesn't apply to Asian states or Japan in particular? Is it never relevant or something else going on? The second is that, well, so in the presentation, you write that support for AUKUS is associated with support for South Korean membership, but we could, since it's a correlation, we could flip it, which is that support for South Korean membership could explain why some Japanese support AUKUS. And I guess I wondered if you could say a little bit about perhaps there's sort of different worldviews in Japan, one group that sees this more holistically, as opposed to those who see it more dyadically. So this is not so much a question, but sort of an invitation to elaborate on different strands that might be thinking, influencing popular visions of Japanese foreign policy. For Umar, again, really interesting paper. I didn't really quite think of this until I read the paper, which is that a lot of the higher literature really does think of Southeast Asia in terms of ASEAN's collective identity. And what the paper does, I think if I could phrase it in my own words, is that, of course, Southeast Asia's regional identity does matter, but to focus on that to explain AUKUS is to put the cart before the horse, because historically, Southeast Asia's collective identity has emerged through practices of managing great power competition, not the other way around. And if I could summarize sort of the tension that I think Umar is getting at, there's this popular saying in Southeast Asia, when elephants fight, the grass suffers. But when elephants make love, the grass suffers too. And Southeast Asian states are constantly trying to balance this out. So I guess the question, I hope that you could elaborate a little bit more, and I know this is simplification, but I thought the question that I hope you could elaborate a little bit more on, why do we see this divergence then, which is your question that you started out with? Why does Indonesia and Malaysia so starkly opposed it for this arms racing reason, but why are the other countries a little bit more neutral? Is it that they're trying to avoid escalation altogether, or they're kind of happy to see the balance come out a bit more evenly? Okay, for Chuping, I'd like, so this was really interesting to me. I'd like to take up your offer to ask you the Najib question. So in your paper, you say that one of the reasons that there is sort of stability in Malaysia's position towards Southeast Asia and China, and as well as towards AUKUS, is because of this continuity of the regime over time. This seems to me to be a little bit different from, as you pointed out, from Najib, who was part of the ruling regime at the time, UMNO. But he was frequently criticized for being too close to China, and that when Mahathir took over, he had to sort of scale back some of these projects with the BRI. And we also, so I guess the first question is, what is sort of going on here? Is this really continuity? And I guess if you'd like to, I wondered if you'd like to engage sort of the papers on race a little bit, because we know that there is a historical animosity between Chinese Malaysians and Malay Malaysians, which is partly a function of British divide and rule strategies, and whether this has any role to play in how Malaysia thinks of China and AUKUS as well. I guess I would also like if you guys would like to, if Chu-Ping and Umar could take up a little bit of this interesting tension between whether Southeast Asia's approach to regional order is kind of shaped by this sort of balancing dynamic that Umar has talked about, but there's also this internal dynamic where frequently Southeast Asian states get criticized for being too close to China, and how do these sort of leaders manage this out? Okay, moving along, there's a lot of papers. For Christina, so this was also really interesting to me, and I think you're getting at this interesting tension. You're not, as I understand it, you're not really taking either side between strategic clarity and strategic ambiguity, but sort of uncovering a set of tensions that Taiwan has to face. For me, coming from Southeast Asia, the constant fear I think that Southeast Asians have of great power competition is becoming the next Cuban Missile Crisis, that this isn't really our conflict, but we sort of get entangled in it for reasons that are beyond our control. So sometimes when you sort of advocated for strategic clarity, this was a little surprising to me, not as a Taiwanese, obviously, but as someone from Southeast Asia. So I guess I wondered if you could say a little bit about why that is. Is Taiwan sort of different, but also perhaps I think what you're trying to say is that there was perhaps a time that strategic ambiguity might have made sense as a policy that Taiwan would embrace, but perhaps that time is over. But I wasn't quite sure if that's what you're saying, why that time has ended. Okay, last.
Oh, sorry, we lost you a little bit. Can you please repeat your point? We had an issue with the sound, I think. Sorry about that.
No problem. Is it for Christina? Okay, so just to briefly repeat the point for Christina, I was hoping that you could say a little bit about, I guess, to put it briefly, are there conditions under which strategic ambiguity would have made more sense? And are those conditions used to be present but no longer are, such that Taiwan needs to rethink what it would prefer the US to do? Okay, moving finally to the two papers on the Anglosphere. First for Nick, again, really interesting paper. I think really helped me to understand the particularly oceanic imagination of Britain's role in the world, and one that is based on trade. I was hoping that you could elaborate a little bit to what extent. So I think you suggested that part of the way that the UK has coped with the loss of empire is to sort of tether itself to a supporting role to the US as a sort of offshoot of the Anglo-Saxon empire, if you will. And I guess I wondered if you could say a little bit about whether this is always a sensible rhetorical strategy, especially given, you know, the history of the US opposing the UK on issues like the nationalization of the Suez. Another instance that comes to mind, which is on your slide, is ANZUS, right? Which the UK wanted to be a part of, and the US sort of said no. So it seems that by tethering the UK's, well, global Britain's prestige as riding on American empire seems to have certain legitimacy costs as well, because it always gives the US the autonomy to say no, and it has done so in the past. So I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit on that. And for Jack, finally, again, super interesting. I'm very glad that I could read your book. This might be a little bit of an unfair question, because it's got to do with New Zealand. And I guess, like ANZUS and CETO, I guess I was hoping you could say a little bit, and it's not because I think people who care about AUKUS really care about New Zealand in and of itself, but I think comparing the exclusion of New Zealand is interesting for understanding why Australia is so committed to the Anglo-Spheric project in a way that not every country in that region is. And so I think one way of putting this is that you paint this picture of like, this is an old coalition, but clearly for New Zealand, at least, history is not destiny. And in the chapter, you mentioned this really interesting line, which you don't say in the presentation, which is that there's a divide between extroverted Anglo-Spheric members and the more introverted ones, Canada and New Zealand. And I was hoping you could say a little bit about why we had this divergence, specifically on the New Zealand side compared to Australia. And for those coming in the afternoon, there's a paper as well on why AUKUS, not caucus. So if you're waiting for the Canadian explanation, that will be coming. Okay, again, really rich set of papers. I hope I did justice to 7 papers. a great set of comments. And we'd also like to take questions from the audience as well. Surjan, should I manage that, or would you like to manage that?
I'm happy to help out. Sorry. Let's see. Yeah, well, the one question in the audience is the last question you had for Jack. So that's perfect. Why don't we go perhaps to the panelists and see what they say to each of your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks. Should we start with Sushi? We'll go in the order of the program again.
Okay, got it. So thank you so much for the comments and well, good news, bad news. Good news is I have some answers to your questions, but the most of them out of the survey, I was checking the Qualtrics now. We actually asked the question whether the people think the AUKUS as the alliance, and the only 8% said that it's not alliance. So, well, they are not IR scholars, so they don't know the definition of the alliance. They don't know about the ATOF. They don't know about the release. So the thing is that most of the people answer, I do not know. That's a 40%. They can't judge. But I guess the nearly 60% either said that it's an alliance clearly, or alliance, but it's different from the US-Japan alliance. So somehow people think, it's something connecting the country to deter China, obviously. They said that. So people have some sense. That's a 60% of people answered that way. And by the way, the survey actually used the word alliance to describe the AUKUS. So maybe we did some priming in this type of the question. So we have to make some reservation on that. About your question on Ukraine, we actually did the questionnaire. We did it in September, so people already know Ukraine. And the difference between the Chinese deterrence and the Russian deterrence, we see some difference about the Russian one. It can be because of the fact that how Russians are doing well in Ukraine, I guess. But the Chinese deterrence, Japanese are not that optimistic. That's something we should report. Yes, I guess the Japanese tend to see that the liberal democracy is a Western thing, not the Asian. But I actually did the different survey experiment on South Koreans and their level of the democracy. Japanese know they are liberal democracies. They're a bit different democracy than the prime minister type. The Japanese system. But the presidential election happened this year, and people recognize it's a democracy. So I guess our sort of setting up the survey experiment, we are safe to say we have double standard. So the reverse causality on your final point, we admit that. Good news is that we have another budget to run some experiments. So yeah, we can identify what's going on. That's all what I can say for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Umar, you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you very much for your comment, Amos. And this is something that we will work on. And yeah, thank you very much for your comments and questions. So the first questions on ASEAN. So this is something that we will develop further. But as we could see, ASEAN was actually at the height of the cooperations during the Cold War and then the early post-Cold War era. And then in the context of the response to nuclear security cooperations, it could be seen that ASEAN plays a more prominent role in the Cold War and the early post-Cold War era to maintain regional stability from external interference. However, I think we could see that, and I have mentioned as well in the presentations that the ways in which ASEAN plays role in shaping the response towards AUKUS is not as visible as before. Two reasons for this, as we could see. The first is that because first, Asian member states have developed the Southeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone treaty, in which AUKUS is actually something that is not directly interfering or contravening the CIPS treaty in this context. Also, the fact that the treaty was not signed by nuclear powers, and this is something that highlights, I think, the enforceability of the treaty with regard to the nuclear cooperation. And in the case of AUKUS, the AUKUS itself is not proliferating nuclear weapons. It's the use of the nuclear technology in security cooperation, and there is a technical ambiguity in this context, which makes some Southeast Asian countries actually not rejecting AUKUS with regard to the use of the nuclear-powered submarine technology. So this is something that I think it's a gray zone, and Indonesia is now bringing the case to larger institutions, but it's not something that ASEAN as institutions endorse. But definitely, we need to work it further in the paper, and I think the paper is not actually complete. So there's a space to discuss this. The second is the divergence, and this is also something that is important. So with regard to Indonesia and Malaysia's reservations, I think this is something that relates to the first dilemma that we have identified. It's about they want to maintain regional stability, and this is something that Indonesia and Malaysia wants to do, but they want to seek benefits with the security and economic cooperation. And Indonesia and Malaysia were the true proponents of Zofan and Sin weights, which makes them very critical to nuclear security cooperation in the region. In the context of Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines, I think it relates to the second dilemma. It's about the China question that we have discussed, because these states are actually claimants in the South China Sea maritime territorial dispute, and then the China factor is something that is more prominent. Indonesia and Malaysia has a more not so critical towards China because they have a bilateral relationship, and then the bilateral relationship, especially in the context of Indonesia, makes Indonesia's position is more careful in articulating a response to that. But definitely, this is something that we need to develop further, I think, in the paper. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Umar. Thanks. That clarifies a lot for me. Chuping, you want to go next?
All right. So the Najib question. So initially, during the first half of Najib's administration, he's actually quite like doing the hedging, so in which there is no choosing like US or China. So it was when the Obama administration started the 1MDB investigation triggered by the Department of Justice involving Goldman Sachs and all that. So it was then when Najib made the decision to getting closer to China, because for China, they have this non-interference policy, so they don't mind what's going on inside the domestic politics of a certain country, as long as the investment goes through and all is well. So, and in order to have a great power to legitimize Najib's rule in the country, so it is important for them, for Najib and its and his people to get closer to China. But right after that, when the Pakatan Harapan seized power in 2018, so the BRI project were being renegotiated. So the East Coast Railway is a huge project, and it is very important for Malaysia. So so the term was being renegotiated, and it is still ongoing despite the pandemic. So it shows that if the smaller country is willing to exercise their autonomy, they will be respected somehow. So this is what smaller countries in Southeast Asia has believed in. But the variations across 10 Southeast Asian ASEAN member states especially is different. I would say it is due to the proximity to China. So Mekong region, the mainland Southeast Asia, would be very difficult for them to resist or to carve a distance with China. So that's another workshop to explain. So your other questions about the historical animosity of Chinese Malaysians. Well, there is no study yet, like the opinion survey conducted by Professor Toga, but I would say that there is not much difference, but it is perhaps defined by the community that you would ask. For example, by their education, by their socio-economic strata. So there might be slight differences, depends on how connected they are to the defense industry, to the government and the like. So I think that would define how they would have different perceptions toward China and also AUKUS. So for example, people from the military and defense, there would be more acceptance because they understand the need to strengthen defense. But after listening to John's presentation, so now that it changed my perception about what we have been explained to, that it is for defensive purpose, but actually nuclear submarine is more offensive than defensive. So if this fact is made known among the policymakers here, well, again, it would change our perceptions about this whole deal. Actually, why Seattle is not mentioned, right? So the establishment of ASEAN is to reject Seattle. So Southeast Asian Treaty Organization is a military organization mirror after NATO, and of which it fell because of Vietnam War. So we have been trying very hard to prevent another military organization in Southeast Asia. So this is why ASEAN is used as a platform to refuse a kind of a major power-led military or defense organization, exactly because of that. So nuclear submarines contention, one by Australia, one of it is that they can sail to South China Sea. So most of the explanation that I have heard is that it is mainly used for Australian continental defense. So they don't have enough to defend their coastline, the entire continent of Australia. So that's why they need it. So if it can be deployed to South China Sea, a precedent that it is a concern to Malaysia, especially, is because of the West Capella standoff in April that was made known around the world in April 2020. So the US and Australian navies were actually holding exercise around the standoff area in which it is coincidentally a British vessel on hired by Malaysians oil and gas company Petronas. So yeah, it doesn't mean very well if that was the case, that the nuclear submarine is offensive and can be deployed for long term and in a very far distance. So yeah, it actually changed the dynamics entirely. So China definitely matter to AUKUS. It is not in the background, it's definitely the main focus. So yeah, tying all this up together, yeah, so there is a reason why Malaysia remains very adamant about they are not very acceptance of the inception of AUKUS in a way. Thank you.
Thank you. That does clarify a bunch for me. And even though I tried to sort of get a bit of a debate between you and Umar, you ended up agreeing quite a lot, which was definitely not my intention. Christina, do you want to go next?
Yes, first of all, I'd like to thank Amos for your comments on my works. But first of all, I think that it's really a tiny relevant thing to bring out the perception from Southeast Asian country, especially I think most of the Southeast Asian country, they got this kind of fear of uncertainty of being entangled into a possible China-Taiwan, military conflict, Taiwan contingency. So in that case, I'd like to highlight the current members. Like Australia would be a great example to contrast with the different perception or kind of a fear of entanglements from Southeast Asian country, right? Australia played a major role in AUKUS and is therefore really a strong supporter of US-led Indo-Pacific strategy. Right. For example, like I think in this 2020 defense strategic update, that Canberra has acknowledged that this Indo-Pacific is like a center of strategic competitions, and was underpinned by the focus on the strengthened international engagement, especially with Japan and United States, India, and ASEAN and other allies and partners. So I think at the same time, we need to take a closer look at the pattern here. So a closer look reveals that the incident of economic coercion from Beijing has been, quite frequently observed since 2017, and that could be arguably make it easier for more decisive for Canberra to kind of abandon its strategic ambiguity. To make a step forward to a regional posture, to strategic alignments with the United States, right? So this shift has presented a more of this kind of stumbling block or back and forth process for the idea of a middle power, diplomacy in Asia Pacific region. But I think this kind of progressive adjustment or evolving regional landscape kind of presented for a really good test for Australia, middle power diplomacy, as Canberra was trying to, coordinate a new course of the foreign policy with its Quad partners, or even, new member from AUKUS, in the future, right? It would kind of, Australia has wanted to actively to get, support from South Korea and Vietnam and New Zealand to join the Quad Plus. And these countries will probably join AUKUS Plus in the future. So I think it's highly possible that more countries in Europe and Asia will probably join, AUKUS, as well. So, but I think that is why that the AUKUS member should remain, strategic ambiguous and not declaring openly hostile attitude to China, so that the member in AUKUS, right, from now on or in the future can maintain the diplomatic engagement and political dialogue with China. And I'd also appreciate that you point out the timing of, is there a specific timing for the United States to shift from the, a strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity to a, US-Taiwan relation? I would say that I'm not really taking a decisive or, black or white attitude to it. I'm just saying that given this a trend, United States wanted to, being some leadership within this emerging security networks like Quad, AUKUS, right, or Indo-Pacific, economic framework, that it's kind of like a direct consequences or important implication that, United States should really be the leader of this emerging organization, and therefore it should, in my opinion, getting declare strategic clarity to Taiwan, so that the member state in their U.S. allies and partnership can somehow remain ambiguous and continue to, engage diplomatically, politically with, a more assertive and strong China. Yeah, that will be all. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Justina. John, you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks. Alice, these are great comments and just a fabulous bunch of responses. I think this is great. So I'll try and respond to Amos and then a couple things that I've heard. So we're academics, so we like to make things more complicated than when they don't need to be as complicated, or we should at least start with the first cut of what something is before we start piling layers on, which are always good for context and genealogy and root causes. At the end of the day, the United States and Australia are very worried about China. And the United States, and now apparently Australia, are convinced that nuclear submarines are the asymmetric advantage that those countries have relative to the Chinese military capability. It's just super simple, right? If you look at any strategic plan the United States has for the defense of Taiwan, for the defense of Japan, for competing with China, it is the undersea domain where the United States is still pretty much unrivaled. And it is the one thing that the United States has confidence in, can operate unmolested largely unmolested by Chinese forces. Okay, I'm not giving any secrets away. This is in the open source plans of the United States Navy and the Defense Department Indo-Pacific. So just super simple. And then we start with that, and then we can make it more complicated after that. So Chu-Ping and Amos, perhaps I misspoke, but I think we're all, we all study this. We all know offense is in the eyes of the beholder. Everyone thinks they're doing stuff for defensive reasons. So I won't weigh in on that. I'm going to pick a fight with my cousins across the Atlantic in a little bit, but when you're fighting for a global order, right, you have to have worldwide power projection capability. Like, by definition, if you defend a global order, you're going to have something that looks very offensive to people in Malaysia. And that's just sort of how it works. I'm pretty sure, listen, I don't necessarily agree or disagree with what the United States is doing right now, but I'm pretty sure Japan, Taiwan, and maybe the Philippines don't necessarily think of these nuclear submarines as offensive. They are very excited that an undersea capability, more undersea capability, can flow towards their part of the world very quickly and stealthily. So I just want to make that very clear. And then Amos, you asked a fascinating question, which kind of blew me away. So you say it's clear what Australia gets out of this, but you're not sure what the United States gets out of that. I'm actually the reverse, right? I think what the United States gets out of this is the fact that Australia is in the region, but pretty far outside the range rings of the continental Chinese, the Chinese mainland. It's a stalwart ally for a variety of reasons that Nick and Jack and others have talked about. And we want more submarines, right? That's the bottom line. And we're pretty sure Australia tends to fight when we fight. So it seems you don't need defense industry. You don't need the Anglosphere per se. It's just kind of that simple. And I think it's a much, how to put this? I don't think that's very interesting, right? It's just, I think Australia's decision is very interesting. And I really would like to have some Australian scholars, or like people who take in the Australian perspective. Obviously, we have Australian scholars here, because they made a very costly decision that is going to be very hard to execute and hard to go back on. And it has, the United States can build a few submarines and still have room left over for its F-35s and carriers, right? Australia can't. So Australia has decided to really build a military and choose an alliance portfolio where it's like a vassal state to the United States. That's really interesting. That's very significant. So I think in some ways I'm more puzzled by the Australian decision than the American decision. So now to my colleagues. First, let's start with Nick and Jack's presentations. Again, this is sort of a simplification. Like I found their presentations very interesting and they really speak to me. But like, I don't think, and sorry, Surgeon, I just don't think the United States cares about the Anglosphere, right? It just doesn't. I mean, it likes that y'all speak English and it likes that, I mean, obviously there's cultural similarity and there's history, and I don't want to trivialize that. But you know, the United States isn't talking about the Anglosphere, right? And I think one of the things to really think about is, if you really wanted to think about what country the United States cooperates most closely with these days, it's Japan, right? We've had bases in Japan since World War II. We do massive exercises together, right? We do a lot of defense industrial cooperation. And by the way, when Australia is trying to buy its conventional submarines, the United States was trying like hell to convince Australia to buy Japanese submarines, right? It did not want Australia to buy the French submarines. And that was purely to stitch together this alliance between what the United States considers its two most rich and stalwart actors in the region. So I think we really need to, the Anglosphere is a partial explanation. Of course it's important, but at the end of the day, the simpler explanation might be the better one. But this brings me to Atsushi's fascinating talk. So I'm going to abuse my time here and actually ask a question before anyone else gets to ask a question. I actually think it would be fascinating. So you said you have a little bit more money left over for the survey. A couple of suggestions. One is, yeah.
If you don't mind, so I think after this we can go around and we'll each ask a question. I just want to make sure that Jack and Nick get a response since we're on this topic.
Thank you, Amos.
Thank you. Jack, you want to go first?
Thanks. Just to echo that, you're doing a stellar job here with a load of papers, and yeah, really nicely chaired and nicely worked to discuss. And you asked a few general questions. I'll rattle through really quickly before the more specific one. You asked a question about order. Yeah, I can't answer that, but I think we need to read Acharya as much as we need to read Mearsheimer. I think that kind of injection of racialized narratives and a historical racialized narrative needs to come through more in understandings of what international order is today. You asked a question on Ukraine, which was great because I asked the same question 2 weeks ago when at a workshop we had a person from the UK Cabinet Office, and I said, you know, is Ukraine part of or distraction from that battle to promote and defend liberal international order? And he basically said, look, yeah, this is a thing, but don't worry about it. AUKUS is completely undisturbed and is full steam ahead. So that seems to be the UK government line on this, is that AUKUS is like pedal down. They're really, really behind this. On CETO, yeah, great question. I'm going to go down that rabbit hole. I have no idea at the moment, but I'm going to be doing some Googling later. So thanks for flagging that. Your main question for me is Canada and New Zealand, right? So what puts Canada and New Zealand on the outside of AUKUS? And that is pages 56 to 58 of my 2020 book is trying to solve this riddle. I think that Five Eyes blankets over the differences within those 5 states, given the degree of intimacy of intelligence sharing in that organization. And the quote in the chapter on extroverted and introverted partners comes from Rod Lyon, who I was taught by 16 years ago. He's now at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And he argues he adds Ireland into the Five Eyes states, right, to give you 6, and says there's always an introverted and extroverted dyad. So UK, Ireland, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And I think this is a big part of the riddle, is that for the 3 AUKUS states, you have global or regional hegemons who behave in an extroverted fashion. And the introversion on the part of their, introverted dyad partner, that it comes from the suffering of being next to that partner. You also benefit from it in lots of overarching security ways. But if you're in Canada, New Zealand, or Ireland, you know what it's like to have one of these very extroverted AUKUS states next to you. So it's a bit of a strategic culture kind of argument. I'm not a huge fan of strategic culture, but it is that general orientation towards liberal interventionism. There's lots of good reading on that. I mean, Surgeon's getting far too many citations out of this already, but you can research, and Chris Browning's good on this, Duncan Bell and Bellich as well. I just say on the last points that Nick's raised, I won't talk too long, don't worry. But on so looking at some of the riddles of what's going on, I've got a project with Eglantine Staunton at Australian National Uni at the moment, which is on France-Anglosphere relations, and we began that just before AUKUS kicked off, so it looked really prophetic. We had no idea either, right? But we are trying to work this thing out as to why it would be so easy for the Australians to dump France so hard. I think a lot of the answers to that comes through the kinds of things Nick and I are saying in terms of the familial kinship of the Anglosphere. and all the rest of it, which is to do with trust, and a trust that develops off the back of things like the co-constitution of war and racialized narratives, but these perceptions of what Sergeant would call the Anglo-Saxon discourses that go back hundreds of years, that the Anglosphere is something that is qualitatively different from other coalitions. Does the US care? Less than the others, certainly, but it still needs that legitimization, and it still benefits from that old Anglosphere coalition enormously, such that Japan, South Korea, Netherlands, and others, they tend to get bolted on as ad hoc partners. It's a very different relationship from that, what I've called that old Anglosphere coalition, right at the heart of that part of the world. I will shut up now, don't worry.
Thanks, Jack. Nick, you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks very much. And yeah, again, just echo what Jack said there, Amos, about chairing this, doing it brilliantly and expertly. And thank you very much for all the comments and from everybody else's comments. I mean, the main point you put to me was, you know, does the UK lose by being always tethered to the US? Is it a sensible strategy? Are there legitimacy costs? Well, you know, clearly there are. I mean, you mentioned Suez and ANZUS. We might add to that the political effects for the British government of the invasion of Iraq, what it did to Tony Blair. You might also say, you know, the withdrawal from Afghanistan is another example. On the counter side, you might say, well, Wilson kept out of Vietnam, and there has been at least the counterpull of the relationship to Europe, of British interests and connections and interests in the European relationship, and many British political figures and thinkers have thought of the UK as a bridge between the US and the EU, and it was the Eurosceptic breaking of that sort of that saw itself as, you know, positioning Britain in global terms back with its Anglosphere allies, not needing the European relationship in the same way, which incidentally was resisted by the Americans. Obama came to Downing Street and said, you know, don't leave the European Union. That was a sort of breaking, if you like, of that another part of British political history and discourse, which always held in tension this relationship between the US, the Anglosphere, and the European continent or the European Union as it became. I think that's always important to bear in mind. And actually, even when you go back to the late 19th century, Duncan Bell's work shows this very well. You know, people like J.R. Seeley clearly saw the Americans as a competitor world state, and Greater Britain, one of the reasons for needing Greater Britain was this explosive growth in American population, territory, and its economy, a new model of Fordist capitalism it showed the world, and it made Seeley and others think about, you know, what is it that big federal world states have, and how can Britain have the same? Of course, there were others who argued that actually there should be an Anglo-US union, a sort of who had that view of the Anglosphere that brought them all back together, people like Carnegie and others. And again, Duncan Bell's work on this is very good. But again, there's been in this process of tension, and when Winston Churchill sought to sort of maintain a role for the British Empire and Commonwealth after the Second World War, he did so very explicitly as sort of coming alongside the US, recognizing that there was a US world alongside the Empire and Commonwealth, and what he saw as Europe, and that it was those circles that Britain it moved in. So I think that's important to bear in mind. And I would also just say that I mean, I think I hope I didn't give the impression that I think this is all about imperial nostalgia, because these are political traditions and discourses that have been worked and reworked in lots of political projects. In the case of Brexit, you know, from the perspective of Eurosceptics who've been completely outside the mainstream, and then secured a victory in the Brexit referendum, and then a hard break with the European Union. For them, this was the Anglosphere functioned as a very successful part of their political project. So it wasn't just a sort of, you know, a nostalgia that they were asking people to look back to empire. This was a forward-looking political economic project that they prosecuted successfully, and we've seen the consequences of that. And secondly, a point I do want to also make, and I tried to cover this in my remarks, was that the ideas of the Anglosphere, ideas of race, ideas of hierarchy, ideas of natural allies are embedded in institutions and practices and real material activities. And one of the reasons, for example, why Suez, the Americans were able to do what they did about Suez, was because they threatened the Bank of England with cutting off its credit lines and a run on sterling. And that knitting together of both capital investment, the City and Wall Street, big British investments into the US, big US investments into Europe, including Britain after the Second World War, those things provided a political economic framework within which Britain had to consistently take American power seriously. And so it's not simply that the sort of poodle gets a kicking now and then. These are things which had real material import for the British economy and continue to do so. The US is Britain's biggest economic partner. If you disaggregate the European Union down into countries, none of them has the same level of import and export as we do with the US. So there are some of these ideas and arguments are embedded in institutional practices and in political economic subsystems. And my argument about the Indo-Pacific in British political thought was that it's conceived of as a transoceanic space, as a transoceanic geopolitical space, in part because the formation of British power in India in the early 19th century, a political economy was constructed on the basis of it, and that gave substance, if you like, to the colonial mapping, exploration, colonization, and brutality that accompanied it.
Thank you. I think that really helps me understand the full import of what you're getting at, and not, as you put it, not just nostalgia. Okay, we don't have a lot of time. I think what we can do now is, first, if there are questions from Ottawa, we can take those, and if not, we can go around the panelists to ask questions to each other.
I think it's in everyone's best interest for you to take questions. So to avoid this hub and spoke system, we'll just go over to the panelists themselves. There was a question, I think, from John to Atsushi, a methodological one, advice possibly. I'm kind of curious to hear that conversation myself. Sorry for being selfish.
Let's start with John, and if anyone else has questions, you can message me in the chat and I'll put you on the list. Thanks.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's methodological. I actually think I would like to know what Japanese folk think about this idea of an Anglosphere and what kind of work and what glue is holding together AUKUS. Like, that just seems like a really interesting topic to look into. I think if you're going to run the experiment again, I think right now you had Peace, Love, and Dope and Japan eventually joining as a combined treatment. It might be useful if you made AUKUS a strictly security providing agreement and then put out the fact that Japan might join and see if you get something different. I'd really like to see that. And then, the great thing about having no effect from your treatment is that you can just kind of start looking at the correlates, the pre-treatment variables that go into support. And I would just like to know who in Japan supports AUKUS, kind of independent of the treatment. That would be fascinating. Like, I think papers with null hypotheses are great. And if you also included like a model that just showed what type of people support this project, I'd love to see that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's a very good idea.
Okay, does anyone else want to respond to anyone else's presentation? There's lots of fertile ground for that.
I see a point made by Jack about Ben Wellings' book on the Anglosphere. Absolutely. In fact, Ben Wellings was supposed to be on the program for today until about 2 months ago, but he had to pull out. So yes, speaking of a long list of interesting bibliographic entries that can be discussed today. Thank you. Thank you for that, Jack. All right, so I just, if I may, would like to thank Amos Hor for a wonderful job of a discussion and share. Really, I think I speak for everyone when I say we all enjoyed what you had to say. And in fact, it prompted us to have a very long and interesting discussion on part of the panelists. So big thanks to all of the panelists. We're approaching the end of our morning session, so I think many of us have to go to bed, and others probably would enjoy a break. So we continue in about 2 hours. Yes, this will be a panel starting with Lakshman Kumar Behera's presentation, who's also joined us from New Delhi. But this has been wonderful. I will be sending lots of emails to all of you with questions and various other commentary. But please join me in thanking everyone for a wonderful start of the AUKUS conference today. Thank you.